An Electrical Era by John Kendrick Banks. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings can be found in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. An Electrical Era. Jimmy Boy's father and mother had occasion to go to the city for a couple of days recently, and insomuch as Jimmy Boy is such a very moving young person, they did not deem it well to leave him at home in the care of the nurse, who had as much as she could do taking care of his brothers, and so they took him along with them. One evening, having to go out to dinner, they invited a young man in Jimmy Boy's father's employ to come up to the hotel and stay about and keep the little fellow amused until his bedtime, and to look out for him as well after that time until their return, which Fred was very willing to do since he received $2 reward for his trouble. He said afterward that he earned the $2 in the first 10 minutes, playing Waterloo with Jimmy Boy, in which pleasing game Jimmy Boy was Wellington and Fred was Napoleon, but once a year he didn't mind earning $1 or 2 extra in that way. After the game of Waterloo was over, and the Napoleonic Fred had managed to collect the buttons which had been removed from his vest in the first half of the game, the Wellingtonian Jimmy Boy decided that he was tired enough to go to bed, and insomuch as Fred didn't oppose him very hard, to bed he went. And a half-hour later both the boys, young and old, were snoring away as though their lives depended on it. It was quite evident that neither of them was as yet sufficiently strong to stand the game of Waterloo for more than an hour, and I don't really wonder at it, for my own experience has led me to believe that even Bonaparte and Wellington themselves would have been wearied beyond endurance by an hour's play at that diversion, however well they may have stood up under the anxieties of the original battle. In my first game with Jimmy Boy, I lost 5 pounds, 8 buttons, a necktie, 2 handfuls of hair, and a portion of my temper. So, as I say, I do not wonder that they were exhausted by their efforts, and willing to rest after them, though how either of them could sleep with the other snoring as loud as a factory whistle I could never understand. Fred must have been unusually wary, for, as you will see, he slept more than Jimmy Boy did. In fact, it wasn't later than 9 o'clock when the latter waked up. "Say, Fred!" he cried. Fred answered with a deeper snore than ever. "Fred!" cried Jimmy Boy, "I want a drink of water." "Pah!" snored Fred. "Stop your growling and ring the telephone for some ice water," said Jimmy Boy, and again Fred answered with a snore, and in his sleep muttered something that sounded like, "It'll cost you $10 next time," the meaning of which Jimmy Boy didn't understand, but which I think had some reference to what it would cost his father to secure Fred as a companion for Jimmy Boy on another occasion. "Guess I'll have to ring it up myself," said Jimmy Boy, and with that he jumped out of bed and rushed to that delightful machine which is now to be found in most of the modern hotels, by means of which you can ring up anything you may happen to want by turning a needle about on a dial until it points to the printed description of the thing you desire and pushing a red button. "Wonder how they spell ice water," said Jimmy Boy. "E-Y-E spells I, and S-E spells sice, ice." But he looked in vain for any such thing on the dial. "Oh, well," he said, after searching and searching, "I'll ring up anything, and when the boy comes with it I'll order the ice water." So he gave the needle an airy twist, pushed the button, and sat down to wait for the boy. Meanwhile he threw a pillow at Fred, who still lay snoring away on the sofa, only now he was puffing like a freight train when its wheels slip on an icy railway track. "Lazybones!" snickered Jimmy Boy as the pillow landed on Fred's curly head. But Fred answered never a word, which so exasperated Jimmy Boy that he got up with the intention of throwing himself at his sleeping companion, when he heard a queer noise over by the fireplace. "Hello, down there, 521, is that you?" cried somebody. Jimmy Boy stared at the chimney in blank amazement. "Hurry up below there, 521, is that you?" came the voice again. "This room is 521, replied Jimmy Boy, realizing all of a sudden that it was no doubt to him that these words were addressed. "Well then, look sharp, will you? Turn off the fire. Put it out. Do something with it. You can't expect me to come down there with the fire burning, can you? I'm not fireproof, you know," returned the voice. "There isn't any fire here," said Jimmy Boy. "Nonsense!" cried the voice. "What's that roaring I hear?" "Oh, that," Jimmy Boy answered. "That's Fred. He's snoring." "Ah, then I will come down," came the voice, and in an instant there was a smell full of soot, a rustling in the chimney, and a round-faced, fat-stomached, white-bearded little old gentleman with a twinkling eye appeared, falling like a football into the grate and bounding like a tennis ball out into the middle of the floor. "Santa Claus, at your service," he said, bowing low to Jimmy Boy. The boy looked at him, breathless with astonishment for a moment. "Well, well," put in the old man impatiently, "what is it you want with me? I'm very busy, so pray don't detain me. Is it one of my new conversational brownies you are after? If so, say so. Fine things, these conversational brownies." "I've never heard of 'em," said Jimmy Boy. "'Cause why?" laughed Santa Claus, twirling airily about on the toes of his left foot. "'Cause why? Because there ain't never been any for you to hear about. I invented 'em all by myself. You have brownies in books that don't move. Good. I like 'em. You like 'em. We all like 'em. You have brownies out of books. Better. But they can't talk, and all because they're stuffed with cotton. It isn't their fault. It's the cotton's fault. Take a man and stuff him with cotton and he wouldn't be able to say a word. But stuff him with wit and anecdotes and he'll talk. Wherefore I have invented a conversational brownie. He's made of calico, but he's stuffed with remarks, and he has a little metal hole in his mouth, and when you squeeze him, remarks oozes out between his lips, and there you are. Eh? Fine?" "Bully," said Jimmy Boy. "What was that you rang for? Quick, hurry up. I haven't any time to waste at this season of the year." "Well, no," Jimmy Boy answered, not having ever heard of him, of course. "Oh, then you wanted one of my live wood doll babies," said Santa Claus. "Of course. They're rather better than the conversational brownies, perhaps. I guess. I don't know. Still, they last longer, as long as you water 'em. Was it one of those you wanted?" "What is a live wood doll baby?" asked Jimmy Boy. "One o' my newest new things," replied Santa Claus. "'Stead o' making wooden dolls out o' dead wood, I makes 'em out o' live wood. Keep some of the roots alive, make your doll, plant it proper, water it, and it'll grow just like a man. My live oak dolls that I'm making this year, 100 years from now, will be great giants." "Splendid idea," said Jimmy Boy. "But how about the leaves? Don't they sprout out and hide the doll?" "Of course they do, if you don't see that they're pulled off," retorted Santa Claus. "You don't expect me to give you toys and look after 'em all at the same time, do you?" "No," said Jimmy Boy. "Well, it's good you don't," said Santa Claus, turning a somersault backward. "It's werry good you don't, for should you have, you'd have been disappointed. But I say, was that what you wanted? Or were you after one of my new patent typewriters that you wind up? Don't keep me waiting all night." "I never heard of your new patent typewriters that you wind up," Jimmy Boy answered. "That isn't the question," interrupted Santa Claus nervously, "though I suppose it's the answer, for if you had heard of my windable writer it would have been the thing you wanted. It's a grand invention, that machine. You take a key, wind the thing up, having first loaded it with paper, and what do you suppose it does?" "Writes?" asked Jimmy Boy. "Exactly," replied Santa Claus. "It writes stories and poems and jokes. There are 5 keys goes with each machine. 1 poetry key, 1 joke key, 1 fairy tale key, a story of adventure key, and a solemn Sunday school story key, that writes morals and makes you wonder whether you're as good as you ought to be." "Well," said Jimmy Boy, "now that I know about that, that's what I want. Though as a matter of fact I rang you up for a glass of ice water." "What?" cried Santa Claus indignantly, bouncing about the room like a tennis ball. "Me? Do you mean to say you've summoned me away from my work at this season of the year just to bring you a glass of ice water?" I didn't mean for you to bring it," said Jimmy Boy meekly. I must have made a mistake." "It's outrageous," said Santa Claus, stamping his foot. "You hadn't ought to make mistakes. I won't bring you anything on Christmas. No, not a thing, you—" A knock at the door interrupted the little old man, and Jimmy Boy, on going to see who was there, discovered the hall boy with the pitcher of water. "What's that?" asked Santa as Jimmy Boy returned. "It's the water," replied the little fellow, "so I couldn't have made a mistake after all." "Hum!" said Santa Claus, stroking his beard slowly and thoughtfully. I guess the wires must be crossed, so it wasn't your fault, and I will bring you something. But the man who ought to have looked after those wires, and didn't, won't find anything in his stocking but a big hole in the toe on Christmas." The old fellow then shook hands good-bye with the boy and walked to the chimney. "Let's see, what shall I bring you?" he asked, pausing. "The windable rider," said Jimmy Boy. "All right," returned Santa, starting up the chimney. "You can have one if I get it finished in time, but I am afraid this annoying delay will compel me to put off the distribution of those machines until some other year." And with that he was gone. Meanwhile, Jimmy Boy is anxiously waiting for Christmas to see if it will bring him the windable rider. I don't myself believe that it will, for the last I heard Santa had not returned to his workshop, but whether he got stuck in the hotel chimney or not nobody seems to know. End of an Electrical Era by John Kendrick Bangs. Read by Anna Pinto.
Cinderella, or The Little Glass Slipper, by an anonymous author. Read by Mickey Lee Rich. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. There was, many years ago, a gentleman who had a charming lady for his wife. They had one daughter only, who was very dutiful to her parents. But while she was still very young, her mamma died to the grief of her husband and daughter. After a time, the little girl's papa married another lady. Now, this lady was proud and haughty, and had two grown-up daughters as disagreeable as herself. So the poor girl found everything at home changed for the worse. But she bore all her troubles with patience, not even complaining to her father. And in spite of her hard toil, she grew more lovely in face and figure every year. Now the king's son gave a grand ball, and all persons of quality were invited to it. Our two young ladies were not overlooked. Nothing was now talked of but the rich dresses they were to wear. At last the happy day arrived. The two proud sisters set off in high spirits. Cinderella followed them with her eyes until the coach was out of sight, and then she began to cry bitterly. While she was sobbing, her godmother, who was a fairy, appeared before her. "Cinderella," said the fairy, "I am your godmother, and for the sake of your dear mamma, I am come to cheer you up. So dry your tears. You shall go to the grand ball tonight, but you must do just as I bid you. Go into the garden and bring me a pumpkin." Cinderella brought the finest that was there. Her godmother scooped it out very quickly, and then struck it up with her wand, upon which it was changed into a beautiful coach. Afterwards, the old lady peeped into the mouse trap, where she found 6 mice. She tapped them lightly with her wand, and each mouse became a fine horse. The rat trap contained 2 large rats. One of these she turned into a coachman, and the other into a postilion. The old lady then told Cinderella to go into the garden and seek for 6 lizards. These she changed into 6 footmen, dressed in the gayest livery. When all these things had been done, the kind godmother, touching her with her wand, changed her worn-out clothes into a beautiful ball dress embroidered with pearls and silver. She then gave her a pair of glass slippers. That is, they were woven of the most delicate spun glass, fine as the web of a spider. When Cinderella was thus attired, her godmother made her get into her splendid coach, giving her a caution to leave the ball before the clock struck 12. On her arrival, her beauty struck everybody with wonder. The gallant prince gave her a courteous welcome and led her into the ballroom, and the king and queen, were as much enchanted with her as the prince conducted her to the supper table, and was too much occupied in waiting upon her to partake of anything himself. While seated, Cinderella heard the clock strike 11:15. She rose to leave, the prince pressing her to accept an invitation for the ball on the following evening. On reaching home, her godmother praised her for being so punctual and agreed to let her go to the next night's ball. Although she seemed to be tired, her sisters, instead of showing pity, teased her with glowing accounts of the splendid scene they had just left, and spoke particularly of the beautiful princess. Cinderella was delighted to hear all of this, and asked them the name of the princess, but they replied nobody knew her. So much did they say in praise of the lady that Cinderella expressed a desire to go to the next ball to see the princess. But this only served to bring out their dislike of poor Cinderella still more, and they would not lend her the meanest of their dresses. The next evening the two sisters went to the ball, and Cinderella also, who was still more splendidly dressed than before. Her enjoyment was even greater than that of the first ball, and she was so occupied with the prince's tender sayings that she was not so quick in marking the progress of time. To her alarm, she heard the clock strike 12. She fled from the ballroom, but in a moment the coach changed again to a pumpkin, the horses to mice, the coachman and postilion to rats, and footmen to lizards, and Cinderella's beautiful dress to her old shabby clothes. In her haste she dropped one of her glass slippers, and reached home out of breath, with none of her godmother's fairy gifts but one glass slipper. When her sisters arrived after the ball, they spoke in terms of rapture of the unknown princess, and told Cinderella about the little glass slipper she had dropped, and how the prince picked it up. It was evident to all at the court that the prince was determined, if possible, to find out the owner of the slipper. And a few days afterwards, a royal herald proclaimed that the king's son would marry her whose foot the glass slipper should be found exactly to fit. This proclamation caused a great sensation. Ladies of all ranks were permitted to make a trial of the slipper, but it was of no use. Cinderella now said, "Let me try. Perhaps it may fit me." It slipped on in a moment. Great was the vexation of her two sisters at this. But what was their astonishment when Cinderella took the fellow slipper out of her pocket! At that moment the godmother appeared, and touched Cinderella's clothes with her wand. Her sisters then saw that she was the beautiful lady they had met at the ball, and throwing themselves at her feet, craved her forgiveness. A short time after, she was married to the prince, to the intense gratification of the whole court. End of Cinderella, by an anonymous author.
Death and Burial of Poor Cock Robin by H.L. Stevens. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Chad Horner from Ballyclare in County Antrim, Northern Ireland, situated in the northeast of the island of Ireland. Death and Burial of Poor Cock Robin by H.L. Stevens. Who killed Cock Robin? I, said the sparrow, with my bow and arrow, I killed Cock Robin. Who saw him die? I, said the fly, with my little eye, I saw him die. Who caught his blood? I, said the fish, with my little dish, I caught his blood. Who'll make his shroud? I, said the bee, with my thread and needle, I'll make his shroud. Who'll dig his grave? I, said the owl, with my spade and trowel, I'll dig his grave. Who'll bear the pall? We, said the wren, both the cock and the hen, we'll bear the pall. Who'll carry him to the grave? I, said the kite. If it's not in the night, I'll carry him to the grave. Who'll be the parson? I, said the rook. With my little book, I'll be the parson. Who'll sing a psalm? I, said the thrush, as he sat in the bush. I'll sing a psalm. Who'll be the clerk? I, said the lark. If it's not in the dark, I'll be the clerk. Who'll be chief mourner? I, said the dove, because I mourned for my love. I'll be chief mourner. Who'll carry the link? I, said the linnet. I'll fetch it in a minute. I'll carry the link. Who'll toll the bell? I, said the bull, because I can pull. I'll toll the bell. All the birds in the air fell to singing and sobbing when they heard the bell for poor Cock Robin, while the cruel cock sparrow, the cause of their grief, was hung on a gibbet next day like a thief. End of Death and Burial of Poor Cock Robin by H.L. Stevens. This recording is in the public domain.
How the Fairies Borrowed the Moon by Abby Phillips Walker. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit Librivox.org. How the Fairies Borrowed the Moon. I don't suppose that everybody knows why it is that sometimes when you look up at the sky at night you see only a part of the moon, and perhaps nobody would have ever known if the goblins had not spied on the fairies' festival one night and found out and told it. The fairies had for a long time held festivals in the spring and summer and in the fall, but they had never had a winter festival, although one would have thought that the white snow would have made an especially pretty setting for one of their dances. But one night, at a gathering of the fairies, it was proposed to hold a winter festival, and after it had been talked over a little, every fairy there was enthusiastically planning what to do. Finally, one of the fairies said, "I think it would be nicest to have the festival on the lake, and then we will have the smooth ice to dance on." And said another fairy, "We can build a fire over on this side of the lake, so that we can warm ourselves if we get cold." And, said another, "those who do not wish to dance can skate by tying their wands on the bottom of their shoes." The gnomes said they would look after the polishing of the ice by going to Jack Frost and getting him to help them, and they planned to ask North Wind to blow and send some clean white snow, and every fairy was to have her dress trimmed with fur, and each was to wear a little bonnet made of swan's down and tied with a red ribbon. Altogether, the festival was planned to be one of the most elaborate the fairies ever had given. But just as the meeting was breaking up, one of the fairies said, "What are we going to do for light? In the summer we have always had the fireflies to help us, but now they are all fast asleep, and we cannot wake them up, and anyway, their lights are all out at this time of the year." "Why, we have the moon," said one of the fairies. "Yes," said another, "but while the moon is bright enough for us on ordinary nights, we certainly need more light than she will give for so great a festival as we are going to have." "That's so," said the first fairy, "but I do not see how we can get anything brighter." "The moon would be all right if only it was nearer, so that its light would shine better," said another fairy, and after thinking a minute she said, "I wonder if we could not borrow the moon." "Borrow the moon!" cried half a dozen fairies in chorus. "Why, what would people think?" "Well," said the fairy, "if we couldn't borrow the whole of it, perhaps we could borrow a piece of it, and then if we left the rest of it to shine in the sky, perhaps the people wouldn't notice it." "That's not such a bad idea," said the queen of the fairies, "and I will appoint a committee to try and arrange it." So she named 3 of the fairies to act as a committee to borrow the moon. The day before the festival was to take place, the 3 fairies all got astride of a broomstick, which a witch loaned them, and sailed away up into the sky. And when the man in the moon saw them coming toward him, he was very much surprised, and was more surprised when he heard the curious request that they had to make. "Will I lend you the moon?" he said. "Why, what a strange thing to ask me! What do you think all the people down on the earth would say if they found out that I had done such an unheard of thing? They might even make me move out of the moon and go somewhere else, and I have lived here so long that I would never be happy anywhere else." "But," said the fairies, "if we do not have some light, our festival will be a failure, and this is the first winter festival we have ever had, and Jack Frost has been just splendid in helping us, and we think you might help too. If you won't loan us the whole of the moon, couldn't you loan a part of it? We will be sure to bring it back just as good as it was when we took it." "How big a piece would you want?" asked the man. "Just as big as you can spare," said the fairies. "Well," he said, after thinking a minute, "you have come a long way, and I would like to help you, and I certainly want your festival to be a success. So I'm going to let you take a piece off the edge, but so as to be sure that you return it, I am going to make one of your fairies stay here all the time the piece is gone, and when it is returned, the fairy can go home." So the fairies drew lots as to which one should stay, and the man took a big saw and sawed off a piece of the moon, right near the edge where the people would be least likely to notice it was gone. And the two fairies took it with them on the broomstick back to the earth. And such a festival as the first winter festival was! Everybody voted it the best they had ever had, and all agreed that the piece of the moon which they borrowed gave the finest light. After the festival was over, the two fairies took it back to the sky and returned with their sister, who had stayed there while they were away. The man in the moon was so pleased with the visit of the fairies that he told them that they could borrow a part of the moon any time they liked. And so when you look up in the sky and see only a part of the moon there, why, perhaps the fairies are holding another festival and have borrowed another piece of the moon. End of How the Fairies Borrowed the Moon by Abby Phillips Walker. Read by Anita Sloma-Martinez.
How Odin Lost His Eye, from In Days of Giants. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. In the beginning of things, before there was any world or sun, moon and stars, there were the giants, for these were the oldest creatures that ever breathed. They lived in Jotunheim, the land of frost and darkness, and their hearts were evil. Next came the gods, the good Aesir, who made earth and sky and sea, and who dwelt in Asgard, above the heavens. Then were created the queer little dwarfs, who lived underground in the caverns of the mountains, working at their mines of metal and precious stones. Last of all, the gods made men to dwell in Midgard, the good world that we know, between which and the glorious home of the Aesir stretched Bifrost, the bridge of rainbows. In those days, folks say, there was a mighty ash tree named Yggdrasil, so vast that its branches shaded the whole earth and stretched up into heaven where the Aesir dwelt, while its roots sank far down below the lowest depth. In the branches of the big ash tree lived a queer family of creatures. First there was a great eagle, who was wiser than any bird that ever lived, except the two ravens, Thought and Memory, who sat upon Father Odin's shoulders and told him the secrets which they learned in their flight over the wide world. Near the great eagle perched a hawk, and 4 antlered deer browsed among the buds of Yggdrasil. At the foot of the tree coiled a huge serpent, who was always gnawing hungrily at its roots, with a whole colony of little snakes to keep him company, so many that they could never be counted. The eagle at the top of the tree and the serpent at its foot were enemies, always saying hard things of each other. Between the two skipped up and down a little squirrel, a tale-bearer and a gossip, who repeated each unkind remark and, like the malicious neighbour that he was, kept their quarrel ever fresh and green. In one place at the roots of Yggdrasil was a fair fountain called the Urdar-well, where the 3 Norn maidens, who knew the past, present and future, dwelt with their pets, the 2 white swans. This was magic water in the fountain, which the Norns sprinkled every day upon the giant tree to keep it green. Water so sacred that everything which entered it became white as the film of an eggshell. Close beside this sacred well the Aesir had their council hall, to which they galloped every morning over the rainbow bridge. But Father Odin, the king of all the Aesir, knew of another fountain more wonderful still. The 2 ravens whom he sent forth to bring him news had told him. This also was below the roots of Yggdrasil, in the spot where the sky and ocean met. Here for centuries and centuries the great Mimer had sat keeping guard over his hidden well, in the bottom of which lay such a treasure of wisdom as was to be found nowhere else in the world. Every morning Mimer dipped his glittering horn, Giol, into the fountain and drew out a draught of the wondrous water, which he drank to make him wise. Every day he grew wiser and wiser, and as this had been going on ever since the beginning of things, you can scarcely imagine how wise Mimer was. Now it did not seem right to Father Odin that a giant should have all this wisdom to himself, for the giants were the enemies of the Aesir, and the wisdom which they had been hoarding for ages before the gods were made was generally used for evil purposes. Moreover, Odin longed and longed to become the wisest being in the world, so he resolved to win a draught from Mimer's well, if in any way that could be done. One night, when the sun had set behind the mountains of Midgard, Odin put on his broad-brimmed hat and his striped cloak, and taking his famous staff in his hand, trudged down the long bridge to where it ended by Mimer's secret grotto. "Good day, Mimer," said Odin, entering. "I have come for a drink from your well." The giant was sitting with his knees drawn up to his chin, his long white beard falling over his folded arms, and his head nodding, for Mimer was very old, and he often fell asleep while watching over his precious spring. He woke with a frown at Odin's words. "You want to drink from my well, do you?" he growled. "Hey, I let no one drink from my well." "Nevertheless, you must let me have a draught from your glittering horn," insisted Odin, "and I will pay you for it." "Oh, you will pay me for it, will you?" echoed Mimer, eyeing his visitor keenly, for now that he was wide awake, his wisdom taught him that this was no ordinary stranger. "What will you pay for a drink from my well, and why do you wish it so much?" "I can see with my eyes all that goes on in heaven and upon earth," said Odin, "but I cannot see into the depths of the ocean. I lack the hidden wisdom of the deep, the wit that lies at the bottom of your fountain. My ravens tell me many secrets, but I would know all. And as for payment, ask what you will, and I will pledge anything in return for the draught of wisdom." Then Mimer's keen glance grew keener. "You are Odin of the race of gods," he cried. "We giants are centuries older than you, and our wisdom, which we have treasured during these ages, when we were the only creatures in all space, is a precious thing. If I grant you a draught from my well, you will become as one of us, a wise and dangerous enemy. It is a goodly price, Odin, which I shall demand for a boon so great." Now Odin was growing impatient for the sparkling water. "Ask your price," he frowned. "I have promised that I will pay." "What say you, then, to leaving one of those far-seeing eyes of yours at the bottom of my well?" asked Mimer, hoping that he would refuse the bargain. "This is the only payment I will take." Odin hesitated. It was indeed a heavy price, and one that he could ill afford, for he was proud of his noble beauty. But he glanced at the magic fountain bubbling mysteriously in the shadow, and he knew that he must have the draught. "Give me the glittering horn," he answered. "I pledge you my eye for a draught to the brim." Very unwillingly, Mimer filled the horn from the fountain of wisdom and handed it to Odin. "Drink then," he said. "Drink and grow wise. This hour is the beginning of trouble between your race and mine." And wise Mimas foretold the truth. Odin thought merely of the wisdom which was to be his. He seized the horn eagerly and emptied it without delay. From that moment he became wiser than anyone else in the world, except Mimer himself. Now he had the price to pay, which was not so pleasant. When he went away from the grotto, he left at the bottom of the dark pool one of his fiery eyes, which twinkled and winked up through the magic depths like the reflection of a star. This is how Odin lost his eye, and why from that day he was careful to pull his grey hat low over his face when he wanted to pass unnoticed. For by this oddity folk could easily recognize the wise lord of Asgard. In the bright morning, when the sun rose over the mountains of Midgard, old Mimer drank from his bubbly well a draught of the wise water that flowed over Odin's pledge. Doing so, from his underground grotto he saw all that befell in heaven and on earth, so that he also was wiser by the bargain. Mimer seemed to have secured rather the best of it, for he lost nothing that he could not spare, while Odin lost what no man can well part with, one of the good windows wherethrough his heart looks out upon the world. But there was a sequel to these doings, which made the balance swing down in Odin's favour. Not long after this, the Aesir quarrelled with the Vanir, wild enemies of theirs, and there was a terrible battle. But in the end the two sides made peace, and to prove that they meant never to quarrel again, they exchanged hostages. The Vanir gave to the Aesir old Njord the Rich, the lord of the sea and the ocean wind, with his two children, Frey and Freya. This was indeed a gracious gift, for Freya was the most beautiful maid in the world, and her twin brother was almost as fair. To the Vanir in return, Father Odin gave his own brother Honir, and with Honir he sent Mima the wise, whom he took from his lonely well. Now the Vanir made Honir their chief, thinking that he must be very wise, because he was the brother of great Odin, who had lately become famous for his wisdom. They did not know the secret of Mima's well, how the hoary old giant was far more wise than anyone who had not quaffed of the magic water. It is true that in the assemblies of the Vanir, Honir gave excellent counsel, but this was because Mima whispered in Honir's ear all the wisdom that he uttered. Witless Honir was quite helpless without his aid, and he did not know what to do or say. Whenever Mima was absent he would look nervous and frightened, and if folk questioned him he always answered, "Yes, yes, now go and consult someone else." Of course, the Vanir soon grew very angry at such silly answers from their chief, and presently they began to suspect the truth. "Odin has deceived us," they said. "He has sent us his foolish brother with a witch to tell him what to say. Ha! We will show him that we understand the trick." So they cut off poor old Mima's head and sent it to Odin as a present. The tales do not say what Odin thought of the gift. Perhaps he was glad that now there was no one in the whole world who could be called so wise as himself. Perhaps he was sorry for the danger into which he had thrust a poor old giant who had never done him any wrong, except to be a giant of the race which the Aesir hated. Perhaps he was a little ashamed of the trick which he had played on the Vanir. Odin's new wisdom showed him how to prepare Mima's head with herbs and charms, so that it stood up by itself quite naturally and seemed not dead. Thenceforth Odin kept it near him, and learned from it many useful secrets which it had not forgotten. So in the end Odin fared better than the unhappy Mima, whose worst fault was that he knew more than most folk. That is a dangerous fault, as others have found, though it is not one for which many of us need fear being punished. End of How Odin Lost His Eye.
Jack and the Beanstalk from Favorite Fairy Tales by Logan Marshall. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Jack was an idle, lazy boy who would do no work to support his widowed mother, and at last they both came to such poverty that the poor woman had to sell her cow to buy food to keep them from starving. She sent Jack to market with the cow, telling him to be sure and sell it for a good price. As Jack was going along the road to market, he met a butcher. The butcher offered to buy the cow in exchange for a hatful of colored beans. Jack thought the beans looked very pretty, and he was glad to be saved the long, hot walk to market. So he struck the bargain on the spot and ran back to his mother with the beans, while the butcher went off with the cow. But the poor widow was very disappointed. She scolded her son for an idle, lazy, good-for-nothing boy, and flung the beans out of the window in a passion. Now the beans were magic beans, and the next morning, when Jack awoke, he found some of them had taken root in the night, and had grown so tall that they reached right up into the sky. Jack was full of wonder and curiosity, and being fond of adventure and excitement, he set out at once to climb the beanstalk to see what was up at the top of it. And he climbed, 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 until at last he climbed right up to the very tip-top of the beanstalk. Then he found himself standing in a strange country. In the distance he could see a big castle, and as he was hot and tired with his long climb, he thought he would go and ask for something to eat and drink. He had not gone very far before he met a fairy, who told him that the castle belonged to a wicked ogre who had killed and eaten a great number of people. "It was he who killed your father," she said, "and it is your duty to do your utmost to destroy the wicked monster. Go now and see what you can do. If you can carry off any of his treasures, you are at liberty to do so, for none of them really belongs to him. He has taken them all by force from the people whom he has robbed and killed." Jack was delighted at the idea of this adventure, and set off in high spirits towards the castle. The castle was farther off than he had thought, and by the time he reached the gates, it was so late that he made up his mind to ask for a night's lodging. There was a woman standing in the doorway, but when Jack made his request, she was very frightened and said, "Indeed, I dare not take you in and give you food and lodging. My husband is an ogre who lives on human flesh. If he were to find you here, he would think nothing of eating you up in 3 mouthfuls. I advise you to go away at once before he comes home." But when she saw how tired and hungry Jack really was, she took him in the house and gave him plenty to eat and drink. While Jack was eating his food in the kitchen, there came a loud knocking at the door. The ogre's wife, in a great flurry, hid Jack in the oven, and then hurried to let her husband in. Jack peeped through the oven door and saw a terrible-looking ogre, who came stamping into the kitchen and said in a voice like thunder, "Wife, I smell fresh meat." "It is only the people you are fattening in the dungeon," said the wife. So the ogre sat down and ate his supper. After supper he commanded his wife to bring him his money bags. He then began to count his money, thousands and thousands of pieces of gold and silver. Jack wished he could take some of this money home to his mother, and presently, when the ogre fell asleep, he crept out of his hiding place, and hoisting the bags upon his shoulder, slipped quietly away with them. The ogre was snoring so loudly that it sounded like the wind in the chimney on a stormy night. So he never heard the little noise Jack made, and Jack got safely away and escaped down the beanstalk. His mother was overjoyed to see him, for she had been very anxious about him when he did not come home the night before, and she was delighted with the bags of money, which were enough to keep them in comfort and luxury for some time. For many months Jack and his mother lived happily together, but after a while the money came to an end, and Jack made up his mind to climb the beanstalk again, and carry off some more of the ogre's treasures. So one morning he got up early, put on a different suit of clothes, so that the ogre's wife should not recognize him, and set out to climb the beanstalk. And he climbed, 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 until at last he climbed to the very top and found himself in the ogre's country again. When he reached the castle, the ogre's wife was again standing in the doorway, but when Jack asked for a night's lodging, she said she dared not give him one, for only a few months before she had taken in a poor boy who seemed half dead with fatigue and hunger, and in return for her kindness he had stolen some of her husband's money and run away in the night. But Jack begged so hard that at last she relented. She gave him a good supper and hid him in a closet before her husband came home. Presently there was a great noise outside and heavy footsteps that shook the castle to its foundations. It was the ogre come home. As soon as he entered the kitchen, he sniffed suspiciously and said, "I smell meat." "It is only the crows on the housetops," said his wife. "They have brought home a piece of carrion for their young." After supper the ogre told his wife to fetch his hen. This hen was a very wonderful bird. Whenever the ogre said, "Lay," she laid an egg of solid gold. Jack thought that if he could only get this wonderful hen to take home to his mother, they would never want any more. So when the ogre fell asleep, as he did after a little while, he came out of the closet, and seizing the hen in the arms, made off with her. The hen squawked, But the ogre's snoring was like the roaring of the sea when the tide is coming in, and Jack got safely down the beanstalk. The hen laid so many golden eggs that Jack and his mother became quite rich and prosperous, and there was really no need for Jack to go again to the ogre's country. But he liked the danger and excitement, and he remembered that the fairy had told him to take as many of the ogre's treasures as he could. And at last, without saying a word to anybody, he started off once more to climb the magic beanstalk. And he climbed, 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 until at last he reached the very tip-top and stood in the ogre's country. This time, when he reached the castle, he began to be afraid that the ogre's wife really would not let him in. "Indeed and indeed I dare not," she said. "Twice lately have I given shelter to a wayfaring youth, and each time he stole some of my husband's treasures and made off with them. Now my husband has forbidden me, on pain of instant death, to give food or lodging to any traveller." But Jack pleaded and pleaded, and at last the good-natured woman, moved to pity by his travel-stained appearance, gave way and let him into the castle. When the ogre came home, the wife hid Jack in the copper. As usual, the ogre's first words were, "Wife, wife, I smell fresh meat." And in spite of all his wife could say, he insisted upon searching all round the room. Jack was in terrible fright whilst he was hunting, but fortunately he forgot to look in the copper, and after a time he sat down to his supper. When supper was over, the ogre told his wife to fetch his harp. Jack peeped out of the copper and saw the harp brought in and set down before the ogre. It was marvellously made, and when the ogre said "Play," it played the finest music without being touched. Jack was enchanted, for he had never before heard such wonderful music, and he felt that he must have the harp for his own. The ogre was soon lulled to sleep by the sweet sound of the harp, and when he was snoring heavily, Jack crept out of the copper, and taking up the harp, was about to make off with it. But the harp was a fairy harp, and it called out loudly, "Master! Master! Master!" And although the ogre was snoring so noisily that it was like the sound of 100 dragons roaring at once, yet to Jack's dismay and horror he heard the voice of his harp, and starting to his feet with a bellow of anger, rushed after the daring thief. Jack ran faster than he had ever run in his life before, still carrying the precious harp, while the ogre ran after him, shouting and roaring and making such a noise that it sounded like 1,000 thunderstorms all going at once. If he had not drunk so much wine for supper, the ogre must very soon have caught Jack. But as it was, the wine had got into his head, and so he could not run nearly so fast as usual, and Jack reached the beanstalk just in front of him. It was a very close shave. Jack slid down the beanstalk at his top speed, calling at the top of his voice for his mother to fetch him an axe. The ogre came tumbling down the beanstalk after him, but Jack seized the axe and chopped the beanstalk off close to the root. Down came the beanstalk, down came the ogre, and falling headlong into the garden, he was killed on the spot. After this, Jack quite gave up his lazy, idle ways, and he and his mother, with the magic hen and the wonderful harp, lived in happiness and prosperity the rest of their life. End of Jack and the Beanstalk from Favorite Fairy Tales by Logan Marshall. Read by Aparna Bhat.
The Mirror of Matsuyana from Journey Through Bookland by Charles H. Sylvester. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wayne Cooke. The following pretty little story comes from Japan, where it may be found in a collection of tales for children. A long time ago a young couple lived in the country with their only child, a beautiful little girl whom they loved tenderly. The names of the parents cannot be told now, for they have long been forgotten. But we know that the place where they lived was Matsuyana, in the province of Ichigo. Now it happened, when the child was still very little, that her father was obliged to go to the capital of the kingdom. As it was so long a journey, neither his wife nor his child could go with him, and he departed alone, promising to bring them many pretty gifts on his return. The mother had never been away from the neighborhood, and was not able to get rid of some fear when she thought of the long journey her husband must take. At the same time, however, she could not but feel pride and satisfaction that it was her husband who was the first man in all that region to go to the rich city where the king and the nobles lived, and where there were so many beautiful and marvelous things to be seen. At last, when the good wife knew that her husband would return, she dressed her child gaily in the best clothes she had, and herself in the blue dress that she knew he liked very much. It is not possible to describe the joy of the good woman when she saw her husband return safe and sound. The little one clapped her hands and laughed with delight when she saw the toys her father had brought, and he never tired of telling of the wonderful things he had seen on his journey and at the capital. "To you," he said to his wife, "I have brought a thing of wonderful power that is called a mirror. Look and tell me what you see inside." He handed her a little flat box of white wood, and when she opened it she saw a metal disc. One side was white as frosted silver, and ornamented with birds and flowers raised from the surface. The other side was shining and polished like a window pane. Into this the young wife gazed with pleasure and astonishment, for from the depths she saw, looking out at her, a smiling face with parted lips and animated eyes. "What do you see?" repeated the husband, charmed by her amazement, and proud to prove that he had remembered her in his absence. "I see a pretty young woman who looks at me and moves her lips as if talking, and who wears, what a wonderful thing, a blue dress exactly like mine." "Silly one, what you see is your own sweet face," replied the man, delighted to know that his wife did not recognize herself. "This circle of metal is called a looking-glass. In the city every woman has one, although here in the country no one has seen one until today." Enchanted with her gift, the woman passed several days in wonderment, because, as I have said, this was the first time she had seen a mirror, and consequently the first time she had seen the image of her own pretty face. This wonderful jewel she thought too precious to be used every day, and the little box she guarded carefully, concealing it among her most precious treasures. Years passed, the good man and his wife living happily through them all. The delight of his life was the child, who was growing into the living image of her dear mother, and who was so good and affectionate that everybody loved her. The mother, remembering her own passing vanity over her beauty, kept the mirror hidden to protect her daughter from any chance of vanity. As for the father, no one had spoken of the glass, and he had forgotten all about it. Thus the child grew up frank and guileless as her mother wished, knowing nothing of her own beauty or what the mirror might reflect. But there came a day of terrible misfortune to this family, till then so happy. The devoted and loving mother fell sick, and although her daughter watched her with affectionate and tender devotion, the dear woman grew worse and worse each day. When she knew that she must soon pass away, she was very sad, grieving for husband and daughter that she must leave behind on earth. and especially was she anxious for the future of her loving daughter. Calling the girl to the bedside, she said, "My beloved child, you see that I am so very sick that soon I must die and leave you and your father alone. Promise me that when I am gone, every morning when you get up, and every night when you go to bed, you will look into the mirror which your father gave me long ago. In it you will see me smiling back at you, and you will know that I am ever near to protect you." Having spoken these words, she pointed to the place where the mirror was hidden, and the girl, with tears on her cheeks, promised to do as her mother wished. Tranquil and resigned, the mother then passed quickly away. The dutiful daughter, never forgetting her mother's wishes, each morning and evening took the glass from the place where it was hidden, and gazed at it intently for a long time. There she saw the face of her dead mother, brilliant and smiling, not pallid and ill as it was in her last days, but young and beautiful. To this vision each night she confided the troubles and little faults of the day, looking to it for help and encouragement in doing her duty. In this manner the little girl grew up as if watched over and helped by a living presence, trying always to do nothing that could grieve or annoy her sainted mother. Her greatest pleasure was to look into the mirror and feel that she could truthfully say, "Mother, today I have been as you wished that I should be." After a time the father observed that his daughter looked lovingly into the mirror every morning and every evening, and appeared to converse with it. Wondering, he asked her the cause of her strange behavior. The girl replied, "Father, I look every day into the glass to see my dear mother and to speak with her." She then related to him the last wishes of her dying mother, and assured him that she had never failed to comply with them. Wondering at such simplicity and loving obedience, the father shed tears of pity and affection. Nor did he ever find the heart to explain to the loving daughter that the image she saw in the mirror was but the reflection of her own beautiful face. Thus, by the pure white bond of her filial love, each day the charming girl grew more and more like her dead mother. End of The Mirror of Matsuyana.
My Lord Bag of Rice, from Japanese Fairy Tales, by Yi Theodora Ozaki. Read by Mickey Lee Rich. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Long, long ago, there lived in Japan a brave warrior known to all as Tuara Toda, or My Lord Bag of Rice. His true name was Fujiwara Hidesato, and there is a very interesting story of how he came to change his name. One day he sallied forth in search of adventure, for he had the nature of a warrior and could not bear to be idle. So he buckled on his 2 swords, took his huge bow, much taller than himself, in his hand, and slinging his quiver on his back, started out. He had not gone far when he came to the bridge of Seto no Karashi, spanning one end of the beautiful lake Biwa. No sooner had he set foot on the bridge than he saw, lying right across his path, a huge serpent dragon. Its body was so big that it looked like the trunk of a large pine tree, and it took up the whole width of the bridge. One of its huge claws rested on a parapet of one side of the bridge, while its tail lay right against the other. The monster seemed to be asleep, and as it breathed, fire and smoke came out of its nostrils. At first, Hidesato could not help feeling alarmed at the sight of this horrible reptile lying in his path, for he must either turn back or walk right by over its body. He was a brave man, however, and putting aside all fear, went forward dauntlessly. Crunch! Crunch! He stepped now on the dragon's body, now between its coils, and without even one glance backward, he went on his way. He had only gone a few steps when he heard someone calling him from behind. On turning back, he was much surprised to see that the monster dragon had entirely disappeared, and in its place was a strange-looking man who was bowing most ceremoniously to the ground. His red hair streamed over his shoulders, and he was surmounted by a crown in the shape of a dragon's head, and his sea-green dress was patterned with shells. Hidesato knew at once that this was no ordinary mortal, and he wondered much at the strange occurrence. Where had the dragon gone in such a short space of time? Or had it transformed itself into this man? And what did the whole thing mean? While these thoughts passed through his mind, he had come up to the man on the bridge, and now addressed him. "Was it you that called me just now?" "Yes, it was I," answered the man. "I have an earnest request to make to you. Do you think you can grant it to me?" "If it is in my power to do so, I will," answered Hidesato. "But first, tell me who you are." "I am the Dragon King of the lake, and my home is in these waters, just under this bridge." "And what is it you have to ask of me?" said Hidesato. "I want you to kill my mortal enemy, the centipede, who lives on the mountain beyond." And the Dragon King pointed to a high peak on the opposite shore of the lake. "I have lived now for many years in this lake, and I have a large family of children and grandchildren. For some time past, we have lived in terror, for a monster centipede has discovered our home, and night after night it comes and carries off one of my family. I am powerless to save them. If it goes on much longer like this, not only shall I lose all of my children, but I myself must fall a victim to the monster. I am, therefore, very unhappy, and in my extremity, I determined to ask the help of a human being. For days, with this intention, I have waited on the bridge in the shape of the horrible serpent dragon that you saw, in the hopes that some strong, brave man would come along. But all who came this way, as soon as they saw me, were terrified and ran away as soon as they could. You are the first man I have found able to look at me without fear, so I knew at once that you were a man of great courage. I beg you to have pity on me. Will you not help me and kill my enemy, the centipede?" Hidesato felt very sorry for the Dragon King on hearing his story, and readily promised to do what he could to help him. The warrior asked where the centipede lived, so that he might attack the creature at once. The Dragon King replied that its home was on the mountain Mikami, but that as it came every night at a certain hour to the palace of the lake, it would be better to wait till then. So Hidesato was conducted to the palace of the Dragon King under the bridge. Strange to say, as he followed his host downwards, the waters parted to let him pass, and his clothes did not even feel damp as he passed through the flood. Never had Hidesato seen anything so beautiful as this palace built of white marble beneath the lake. He had often heard of the Sea King's palace at the bottom of the sea, where all of the servants and retainers were salt-water fishes, but here was a magnificent building in the heart of Lake Biwa. The dainty goldfishes, red carp, and silvery trout waited upon the Dragon King and his guest. Hidesato was astonished at the feast that was spread for him. The dishes were crystallized lotus leaves and flowers, and the chopsticks were of the rarest ebony. As soon as they sat down, the sliding doors opened, and 10 lovely goldfish dancers came out, and behind them followed 10 red carp musicians with the kodo and the samisen. Thus the hours flew by till midnight, and the beautiful music and dancing had banished all thoughts of the centipede. The Dragon King was about to pledge the warrior in a fresh cup of wine when the palace was suddenly shaken by a tramp, as if the mighty army had begun to march not far away. Hidesato and his host both rose to their feet and rushed to the balcony, and the warrior saw on the opposite mountain 2 great balls of glowing fire coming nearer and nearer. The Dragon King stood by the warrior's side, trembling with fear. "The centipede! The centipede! Those 2 balls of fire are its eyes. It is coming for its prey. Now it is time to kill it." Hidesato looked where his host pointed, and in the dim light of the starlit evening, behind the 2 balls of fire, he saw the long body of an enormous centipede winding round the mountains, and the lights in its 100 feet glowed like so many distant lanterns moving slowly towards the shore. Hidesato showed not the least sign of fear. He tried to calm the Dragon King. "Don't be afraid. I shall surely kill the centipede. Just bring me my bow and arrows." The Dragon King did as he was bid, and the warrior noticed that he had only 3 arrows left in his quiver. He took the bow, and fitting an arrow to the notch, took careful aim and let fly. The arrow hit the centipede right in the middle of its head, but instead of penetrating, it glanced off, harmless, and fell to the ground. Nothing daunted, Hidesato took another arrow, fitted it to the notch of the bow, and let fly. Again, the arrow hit the mark. It struck the centipede right in the middle of its head, only to glance off and fall to the ground. The centipede was invulnerable to weapons. When the Dragon King saw that even this brave warrior's arrows were powerless to kill the centipede, he lost heart and began to tremble with fear. The warrior saw that he had now only 1 arrow left in his quiver, and if this one failed, he could not kill the centipede. He looked across the waters. The huge reptile had wound its horrid body 7 times round the mountain and would soon come down to the lake. Nearer and nearer gleamed fireballs of eyes, and the light of its 100 feet began to throw reflections in the still waters of the lake. Then suddenly the warrior remembered that he had heard that human saliva was deadly to centipedes. But this was no ordinary centipede. This was so monstrous that even to think of such a creature made one creep with horror. Hidesato determined to try his last chance. So taking his last arrow, and first putting the end of it in his mouth, he fitted the notch to his bow, took careful aim once more, and let fly. This time the arrow again hit the centipede right in the middle of its head, but instead of glancing off harmlessly as before, it struck home to the creature's brain. Then, with a convulsive shudder, the serpentine body stopped moving, and the fiery light of its great eyes and 100 feet darkened to a dull glare like the sunset of a stormy day, and then went out in blackness. A great darkness now overspread the heavens. The thunder rolled, and the lightning flashed, and the wind roared in fury, and it seemed as if the world were coming to an end. The Dragon King and his children and retainers all crouched in different parts of the palace, frightened to death, for the building was shaken to its foundation. At last, the dreadful night was over. Day dawned, beautiful and clear. The centipede was gone from the mountain. Then Hidesato called to the Dragon King to come out with him on the balcony, for the centipede was dead and he had nothing more to fear. Then all the inhabitants of the palace came out with joy, and Hidesato pointed to the lake. There lay the body of the dead centipede floating on the water, which was dyed red with its blood. The gratitude of the Dragon King knew no bounds. The whole family came and bowed down before the warrior, calling him their preserver and the bravest warrior in all Japan. Another feast was prepared, more sumptuous than the first. All kinds of fish, prepared in every imaginable way, raw, steamed, boiled, and roasted, served on coral trays and crystal dishes, were put before him, and the wine was the best that Hidesato had ever tasted in his life. To add to the beauty of everything, the sun shone brightly, the lake glittered like a liquid diamond, and the palace was 1,000 times more beautiful by day than by night. His host tried to persuade the warrior to stay a few days, but Hidesato insisted on going home, saying that he had now finished what he had come to do, and must return. The Dragon King and his family were all very sorry to have him leave so soon, but since he would go, they begged him to accept a few small presents, so they said, in token of their gratitude to him for delivering them forever from their horrible enemy, the centipede. As the warrior stood in the porch taking leave, a train of fish was suddenly transformed into a retinue of men, all wearing ceremonial robes and dragon's crowns on their head to show that they were servants of the great Dragon King. The presents that they carried were as follows. First, a large bronze bell. Second, a bag of rice. Third, a roll of silk. Fourth, a cooking pot. Fifth, a bell. Hidesato did not want to accept all these presents, but as the Dragon King insisted, he could not well refuse. The Dragon King himself accompanied the warrior as far as the bridge, and then took leave of him with many bows and good wishes, leaving the procession of servants to accompany Hidesato to his house with the presents. The warrior's household and servants had been very much concerned when they found that he did not return the night before, but they finally concluded that he had been kept by the violent storm and had taken shelter somewhere. When the servants on the watch for his return caught sight of him, they called to everyone that he was approaching, and the whole household turned out to meet him, wondering much what the retinue of men, bearing presents and banners that followed him, could mean. As soon as the Dragon King's retainers had put down the presents, they vanished, and Hidesato told all that had happened to him. The presents which he had received from the grateful Dragon King were found to be of magic power. The bell only was ordinary, and as Hidesato had no use for it, he presented it to the temple near by, where it was hung up to boom out the hour of day over the surrounding neighborhood. The single bag of rice, however much was taken from it day after day for the meals of the night, and his whole family, never grew less. The supply in the bag was inexhaustible. The roll of silk, too, never grew shorter, though time after time long pieces were cut off to make the warrior a new suit of clothes to go to court in at the New Year. The cooking pot was wonderful, too. No matter what was put into it, it cooked deliciously whatever was wanted without any firing. Truly a very economical saucepan. The fame of Hidesato's fortune spread far and wide, and as there was no need for him to spend money on rice or silk or firing, he became very rich and prosperous, and was henceforth known as my Lord Bag of Rice. This is the end of My Lord Bag of Rice from Japanese Fairy Tales by Yi Theodora Ozaki, read by Mickey Lee Rich.
Solomon John Goes for Apples by Lucretia P. Hale. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wayne Cooke. Solomon John agreed to ride to Farmer Jones's for a basket of apples, and he decided to go on horseback. The horse was brought round to the door. Now he had not ridden for a great while, and though the little boys were there to help him, he had great trouble in getting on the horse. He tried a great many times, but always found himself facing the wrong way, looking at the horse's tail. They turned the horse's head first up the street, then down the street. It made no difference. He always made some mistake and found himself sitting the wrong way. "Well," he said at last, "I don't know as I care. If the horse has his head in the right direction, that is the main thing. Sometimes I ride this way in cars because I like it better. I can turn my head easily enough to see where we are going." So off he went, and the little boys said he looked like a circus rider, and they were much pleased. He rode along out of the village under the elms very quietly. Pretty soon he came to a bridge, where the road went across a little stream. There a road at the side, leading down to the stream, because sometimes wagoners watered their horses there. Solomon John's horse turned off too to drink of the water. "Very well," said Solomon John. "I don't blame him for wanting to wet his feet and to take a drink this hot day." When they reached the middle of the stream, the horse bent over his head. "How far his neck comes into his back!" exclaimed Solomon John, and at that very moment he found he had slid down over the horse's head and was sitting on a stone looking into the horse's face. There were two frogs, one on each side of him, sitting just as he was, which pleased Solomon John, so he began to laugh instead of cry. But the two frogs jumped into the water. "It's time for me to go on," said Solomon John. So he gave a jump, as he had seen the frogs do, and this time he came all right on the horse's back, facing the way he was going. "It is a little pleasanter," he said. The horse wanted to nibble a little of the grass by the side of the way, but Solomon John remembered what a long neck he had, and would not let him stop. At last he reached Farmer Jones, who gave him his basket of apples. Next he was to go on to the cider mill up a little lane by Farmer Jones's house to get a jug of cider. But as soon as the horse was turned into the lane, he began to walk very slowly, so slowly that Solomon John thought he would not get there before night. He whistled and shouted and thrust his knees into the horse, but still he would not go. "Perhaps the apples are too heavy for him," he said. So he began by throwing one of the apples out of the basket. It hit a fence by the side of the road, and that started up the horse, and he went on merrily. "That was the trouble," said Solomon John. "That apple was too heavy for him." But very soon the horse began to go slower and slower. So Solomon John thought he would try another apple. This hit a large rock and bounced back under the horse's feet and sent him off at a great pace. But very soon he fell again into a slow walk. Solomon John had to try another apple. This time it fell into a pool of water and made a great splash and set the horse out again for a little while. He soon returned to a slow walk, so slow that Solomon John thought it would be tomorrow morning before he got to the cider mill. "It is rather a waste of apples," thought he, "but I can pick them up as I come back because the horse will be going home at a quick pace." So he flung out another apple. That fell among a party of ducks, and they began to make such a quacking and waddling that it frightened the horse into a quick trot. So the only way Solomon John could make his horse go was by flinging his apples, now on one side, now on the other. One time he frightened a cow that ran along by the side of the road while the horse raced with her. Another time he started up a brood of turkeys that gobbled and strutted enough to startle 20 horses. In another place he came near hitting a boy who gave such a scream that it sent the horse off at a furious rate. And Solomon John got quite excited himself, and he did not stop till he had thrown away all his apples and had reached the corner of the cider mill. "Very well," said he, "if the horse is so lazy, he won't mind my stopping to pick up the apples on the way home, and I am not sure but I shall prefer walking a little to riding the beast." The man came out to meet him from the cider mill and reached him the jug. He was just going to take it when he turned his horse's head round, and delighted at the idea of going home, the horse set off at a full run without waiting for the jug. Solomon John clung to the reins, and his knees held fast to the horse. He called out, "Whoa! Whoa!" but the horse would not stop. He went galloping on past the boy, who stopped and flung an apple at him, past the turkeys that came and gobbled at him, by the cow that turned and ran back in a race with them until her breath gave out, by the ducks that came and quacked at him, by an old donkey that brayed over the wall at him, by some hens that ran into the road under the horse's feet and clucked at him, by a great rooster that stood up on a fence and crowed at him, by Farmer Jones, who looked out to see what had become of him, down the village street, and he never stopped until he reached the door of the house. Out came Mr. and Mrs. Peterkin, Agamemnon, Elizabeth Eliza, and the little boys. Solomon John got off his horse, all out of breath. "Where's the jug of cider?" asked Mrs. Peterkin. "It's at the cider mill," said Solomon John. "At the mill!" exclaimed Mrs. Peterkin. "Yes," said Solomon John. "The little boys had better walk out for it. They will enjoy it, and they had better take a basket, for along the way they will find plenty of apples scattered all along on either side of the lane, and hens and ducks and turkeys and a donkey." The little boys looked at each other and went, but they stopped first and put on their India rubber boots. End of Solomon John Goes for Apples by Lucretia P. Hale.
The Emperor's New Clothes by Hans Christian Andersen, read by Mira Eagle. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Many years ago, there was an emperor who was so excessively fond of new clothes that he spent all his money in dress. He did not trouble himself in the least about his soldiers, nor did he care to go to either the theater or the chase, except for the opportunities then afforded him for displaying his new clothes. He had a different suit for each hour of the day, and as of any other king or emperor, one is accustomed to say, "He is sitting in council." It was always said to him, "The emperor is sitting in his wardrobe." Time passed merrily in the large town which was his capital. Strangers arrived every day at the court. One day, 2 rogues calling themselves weavers made their appearance. They gave out that they knew how to weave stuffs of the most beautiful colors and elaborate patterns, the clothes manufactured from which should have the wonderful property of remaining invisible to everyone who is unfit for the office he held, or who was extraordinary simple in character. "These must indeed be splendid clothes," thought the emperor. "Had I such a suit, I might at once find out what men in my realms are unfit for their office, and also be able to distinguish the wise from the foolish. This stuff must be woven for me immediately." And he caused large sums of money to be given to both the weavers in order that they might begin their work directly. So the 2 pretended weavers set up 2 looms and affected to work very busily, though in reality they did nothing at all. They asked for the most delicate silk and the purest gold thread, put both into their own knapsacks, and then continued their pretended work at the empty looms until late at night. "I should like to know how the weavers are getting on with my cloth," said the emperor to himself. After some little time had elapsed, he was, however, rather embarrassed when he remembered that a simpleton, or one unfit for his office, would be unable to see the manufacture. To be sure, he thought he had nothing to risk in his own person, but yet he would prefer sending somebody else to bring him intelligence about the weavers and their work before he troubled himself in the affair. All the people throughout the city had heard of the wonderful property the cloth was to possess, and all were anxious to learn how wise or how ignorant their neighbors might prove to be. "I will send my faithful old minister to the weavers," said the emperor at last, after some deliberation. "He will be best able to see how the cloth looks, for he is a man of sense, and no one can be more suitable for his office than he is." So the faithful old minister went into the hall where the knaves were working with all their might at their empty looms. "What can be the meaning of this?" thought the old man, opening his eyes very wide. "I cannot discover the least bit of thread on the looms." However, he did not express his thoughts aloud. The impostors requested him very courteously to be so good as to come nearer their looms, and then asked him whether the design pleased him, and whether the colors were not very beautiful, at the same time pointing to the empty frames. The poor old minister looked and looked. He could not discover anything on the looms, for a very good reason, viz., there was nothing there. "What?" thought he again. "Is it possible that I am a simpleton? I have never thought so myself, and no one must know it now if I am so. Can it be that I am fit for my office? No, that must not be said either. I will never confess that I could not see the stuff." "Well, Sir Minister," said one of the knaves, still pretending to work, "you do not say whether this stuff pleases you." "Oh, it is excellent," replied the old minister, looking at the loom through his spectacles. "This pattern, the colors, yes. I will tell the emperor without delay how very beautiful I think them." "We shall be much obliged to you," said the impostors. And then they named the different colors and described the pattern of the pretended stuff. The old minister listened attentively to their words, in order that he might repeat them to the emperor, and then the knaves asked for more silk and gold, saying it was necessary to complete what they had begun. However, they put all that was given them into their knapsacks, and continued to work with as much apparent diligence as before at their empty looms. The emperor now sent another officer of his court to see how the men were getting on, and to ascertain whether the cloth would soon be ready. It was just the same with his gentleman as with the minister. He surveyed the looms on all sides, but could see nothing at all but the empty frames. "Does the stuff appear as beautiful to you as it did to my lord the minister?" asked the impostors of the emperor's second ambassador, at the same time making the same gestures as before and talking of the design and colors which were not there. "I'm certainly not stupid," thought the messenger. "It must be that I am not fit for my good, profitable office. That is very odd. However, no one shall know anything about it." And accordingly, he praised the stuff he could not see and declared that he was delighted with both colors and patterns. "Indeed, please your Imperial Majesty," said he to his sovereign when he returned, "the cloth which the weavers are preparing is extraordinary magnificent." The whole city was talking of the splendid cloth which the emperor had ordered to be woven at his own expense. And now the emperor himself wished to see the costly manufacture while it was still in the loom. Accompanied by a select number of officers at the court, among whom were the two honest men who had already admired the cloth, he went to the crafty impostors who, as soon as they were aware of the emperor's approach, went on working more diligently than ever, although they still did not pass a single thread through the looms. "Is not the work absolutely magnificent?" said the two officers of the crown already mentioned. "If your Majesty will only be pleased to look at it, what a splendid design, what glorious colors!" At the same time they pointed to the empty frames, for they imagined that everyone else could see this exquisite piece of workmanship. "How is this?" said the emperor to himself. "I can see nothing. This is indeed a terrible affair. Am I a simpleton? Or am I unfit to be an emperor? That would be the worst thing that could happen. Oh, the cloth is charming," he said aloud. "It has my complete approbation." And he smiled most graciously and looked closely at the empty looms, for on no account would he say that he could not see what two of the officers of his court had praised so much. All his retinue now strained their eyes, hoping to discover something on the looms, but they could see no more than the others. Nevertheless, they all exclaimed, "Oh, how beautiful!" and advised his Majesty to have some new cloths made from this splendid material for the approaching procession. "Magnificent, charming, excellent!" resounded on all sides, and everyone was uncommonly gay. The emperor shared in the general satisfaction and presented the impostors with the ribbon of an order of knighthood, to be worn in their buttonholes, and the title of gentlemen weavers. The rogues sat up the whole of the night before the day on which the procession was to take place, and had 16 lights burning, so that everyone might see how anxious they were to finish the emperor's new suit. They pretended to roll the cloth off the looms, cut the air with their scissors, and sewed with needles without any thread in them. "See," cried they at last, "the emperor's new clothes are ready!" And now the emperor, with all the grandees of his court, came to the weavers, and the rogues raised their arms as if in the act of holding something up, saying, "Here are your Majesty's trousers. Here is the scarf, here is the mantle. The whole suit is as light as a cobweb. One might fancy one has nothing at all on, one dressed in it. That, however, is the great virtue of this delicate cloth." "Yes, indeed," said all the courtiers, although not one of them could see anything of this exquisite manufacture. "If your Imperial Majesty will be graciously pleased to take off your clothes, we will fit on the new suit in front of the looking-glass." The emperor was accordingly undressed, and the rogues pretended to array him in his new suit, the emperor turning round from side to side before the looking-glass. "How splendid His Majesty looks in his new clothes, and how well they fit!" everyone cried out. "What a design! What colors! These are indeed royal robes." "The canopy which is to be borne over your Majesty in the procession is waiting," announced the chief master of the ceremonies. "I am quite ready," answered the emperor. "Do my new clothes fit well?" asked he, turning himself round again before the looking-glass, in order that he might appear to be examining his handsome suit. The lords of the bedchamber who were to carry his Majesty's train felt about on the ground as if they were lifting up the ends of the mantle, and pretended to be carrying something, for they would by no means betray anything like simplicity or unfitness for their office. So now the emperor walked under his high canopy in the midst of the procession through the streets of his capital, and all the people standing by and those in the windows cried out, "Oh, how beautiful are our emperor's new clothes! What a magnificent train there is to the mantle, and how gracefully the scarf hangs! In short, no one would allow that he could not see these much admired clothes, because in doing so he would have declared himself either a simpleton or unfit for his office. Certainly, none of the emperor's various suits had ever made so great an impression as these invisible ones. "But the emperor has nothing at all on," said a little child. "Listen to the voice of innocence!" exclaimed his father, and what the child had said was whispered from one to another. "But he has nothing at all on!" at last cried out all the people. The emperor was vexed, for he knew that the people were right, but he thought the procession must go on now. And the lords of the bedchamber took greater pains than ever to appear holding up a train, although in reality there was no train to hold. End of The Emperor's New Clothes by Hans Christian Andersen.
The Giant Builder from In Days of Giants. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Ages and ages ago, when the world was first made, the gods decided to build a beautiful city high above the heavens, the most glorious and wonderful city that ever was known. Asgard was to be its name, and it was to stand on Ida Plain under the shade of Yggdrasil, the great tree whose roots were underneath the earth. First of all they built a house with a silver roof, where there were seats for all the 12 chiefs. In the midst, and high above the rest, was the wonder throne of Odin the All-Father, whence he could see everything that happened in the sky, or on the earth, or in the sea. Next they made a fair house for Queen Frigg and her lovely daughters. Then they built a smithy with its great hammers, tongs, anvils and bellows, where the gods could work at their favourite trade, the making of beautiful things out of gold, which they did so well that folk named that time the Golden Age. Afterward, as they had more leisure, they built separate houses for all the Aesir, each more beautiful than the preceding, for of course they were continually growing more skilful. They saved Father Odin's palace until the last, for they meant this to be the largest and the most splendid of all. Gladsheim, the home of joy, was the name of Odin's house, and it was built all of gold, set in the midst of a wood whereof the trees had leaves of ruddy gold, like an autumn gilded forest. For the safety of the All-Father it was surrounded by a roaring river and by a high picket fence, and there was a great courtyard within. The glory of Gladsheim was its wondrous hall, radiant with gold, the most lovely room that time has ever seen. Valhalla, the Hall of Heroes, was the name of it, and it was roofed with the mighty shields of warriors. The ceiling was made of interlacing spears, and there was a portal at the west end before which hung a great grey wolf, while over him a fierce eagle hovered. The hall was so huge that it had 540 gates, through each of which 800 men could march abreast. Indeed, there needed to be room, for this was the hall where every morning Odin received all the brave warriors who had died in battle on the earth below. And there were many heroes in those days. This was the reward which gods gave to courage, when a hero had gloriously lost his life. The Valkyries, the 9 warrior daughters of Odin, brought his body up to Valhalla on their white horses that gallop the clouds. There they lived for ever after in happiness, enjoying the things that they had most loved upon earth. Every morning they armed themselves and went out to fight one another in a great courtyard. It was a wondrous game, wondrously played. No matter how often a hero was killed, he became alive again in time to return perfectly well to Valhalla, where he ate a delicious breakfast with the Gessir, while the beautiful Valkyries who had first brought him thither waited at table and poured the blessed mead, which only the immortal taste. A happy life it was for the heroes, and a happy life for all who dwelt in Asgard, for this was before trouble had come among the gods, following the mischief of Loki. This is how the trouble began. From the beginning of time, The giants had been unfriendly to the Aesir, because the giants were older and huger and more wicked. They were jealous because the good Aesir were fast gaining more wisdom and power than the giants had ever known. It was the Aesir who set the fair brother and sister, sun and moon, in the sky to give light to men, and it was they also who made the jewelled stars out of sparks from the place of fire. The giants hated the Aesir, and tried all in their power to injure them and the men of the earth below, whom the Aesir loved and cared for. The gods had already built a wall around Midgard, the world of men, to keep the giants out. Built it of the bushy eyebrows of Ymir, the oldest and hugest of giants. Between Asgard and the giants flowed Ithing, the great river on which ice never formed, and which the gods crossed on the Rainbow Bridge. But this was not protection enough. Their beautiful new city needed a fortress. So the word went forth in Asgard, "We must build us a fortress against the giants, the hugest, strongest, finest fortress that ever was built." Now one day, soon after they had announced this decision, there came a mighty man stalking up the rainbow bridge that led to Asgard city. "Who goes there?" cried Heimdall the watchman, whose eyes were so keen that he could see for 100 miles around, and whose ears were so sharp that he could hear the grass growing in the meadow and the wool on the backs of the sheep. "Who goes there? No one can enter Asgard if I say no." "I am a builder," said the stranger, who was a huge fellow with sleeves rolled up to show the iron muscles of his arms. "I am a builder of strong towers, and I have heard that the folk of Asgard need one to help them raise a fair fortress in their city." Heimdall looked at the stranger narrowly, for there was that about him which his sharp eyes did not like. But he made no answer, only blew on his golden horn, which was so loud that it sounded through all the world. At this signal all the Aesir came running to the Rainbow Bridge, from wherever they happened to be, to find out who was coming to Asgard, for it was Heimdall's duty ever to warn them of the approach of the unknown. "This fellow says he is a builder," quoth Heimdall, "and he would fain build us a fortress in the city." "Aye, that I would," nodded the stranger. "Look at my iron arm, look at my broad back, look at my shoulders. Am I not the workman you need?" "Truly he is a mighty figure," vowed Odin, looking at him approvingly. "How long will it take you alone to build our fortress? We can allow but one stranger at a time within our city, for safety's sake." "In 3 half years," replied the stranger, "I will undertake to build for you a castle so strong that not even the giants, should they swarm hither over Midgard, not even they could enter without your leave." "Aha!" cried Father Odin, well pleased at this offer. "And what reward do you ask, friend, for help so timely?" The stranger hummed and hawed, and pulled his long beard while he thought. Then he spoke suddenly, as if the idea had just come into his mind. "I will name my price, friends," he said, "a small price for so great a deed. I ask you to give me Freya for my wife, and those 2 sparkling jewels, the sun and the moon." At this demand the gods looked grave, for Freya was their dearest treasure. She was the most beautiful maid who ever lived, the light and life of heaven, and if she should leave Asgard, joy would go with her, while the sun and moon were the light and life of the Aesir's children, men, who lived in the little world below. But Loki the sly whispered that they would be safe enough if they made another condition on their part, so hard that the builder could not fulfill it. After thinking cautiously, he spoke for them all. "Mighty man," quoth he, "we are willing to agree to your price upon one condition. It is too long a time that you ask. We cannot wait 3 half years for our castle. That is equal to 3 centuries when one is in a hurry. See that you finish the fort without help in 1 winter, 1 short winter, and you shall have fair Freya with the sun and the moon. But if, on the first day of summer, 1 stone is wanting to the walls, or if anyone has given you aid in the building, then your reward is lost, and you shall depart without payment." So spoke Loki in the name of all the gods, but the plan was his own. At first the stranger shook his head and frowned, saying that in so short a time no one could complete the undertaking. At last he made another offer. "Let me have but my good horse to help me, and I will try," he urged. "Let me bring the useful Svadilfori with me to the task, and I will finish the work in one winter of short days, or lose my reward. Surely you will not deny me this little help from one four-footed friend." Then again the Aesir consulted, and the wiser of them were doubtful whether it were best to accept the stranger's offer so strangely made. But again Loki urged them to accept. "Surely there is no harm," he said, "even with his old horse to help him. He cannot build the castle in the promised time. We shall gain a fortress without trouble, and with never a price to pay." Loki was so eager that, although the other Aesir did not like this crafty way of making bargains, they finally consented. Then in the presence of the heroes, with the Valkyries and the Mimer's head for witnesses, the stranger and the Aesir gave solemn promise that the bargain should be kept. On the first day of winter the strange builder began his work, and wondrous was the way he set about it. His strength seemed as the strength of 100 men. As for his horse, Svadilfori, he did more work by half than even the mighty builder. In the night he dragged the enormous rocks that were to be used in building the castle, rocks as big as mountains, while in the daytime the stranger piled them into place with his iron arms. The Aesir watched him with amazement. Never was seen such strength in Asgard. Neither Tyr the Stout nor Thor the Strong could match the power of the stranger. The gods began to look at one another uneasily. Who was this mighty one who had come among them? And what if after all he should win his reward? Freya trembled in her palace, and the sun and moon grew dim with fear. Still the work went on, and the fort was piling higher and higher, by day and by night. There were but 3 days left before the end of winter, and already the building was so tall and so strong that it was safe from the attacks of any giant. The Aesir were delighted with their fine new castle, but their pride was dimmed by the fear that it must be paid for at all too costly a price, for only the gateway remained to be completed, and unless the stranger should fail to finish that in the next 3 days, they must give him Freya with the sun and moon. The Aesir held a meeting upon Ida Plain, a meeting full of fear and anger. At last they realized what they had done. They had made a bargain with one of the giants, their enemies, and if he won the prize, it would mean sorrow and darkness in heaven and upon earth. "How did we happen to agree to so mad a bargain?" they asked one another. "Who suggested the wicked plan which bids fair to cost us all that we most cherish?" Then they remembered that it was Loki who had made the plan. It was he who had insisted that it be carried out, and they blamed him for all the trouble. "It is your counsels, Loki, that have brought this danger upon us," quoth Father Odin, frowning. "You chose the way of guile, which is not our way. It now remains for you to help us by guile, if you can. But if you cannot save for us Freya and the sun and moon, you shall die. This is my word." All the other Aesir agreed that this was just. Thor alone was away hunting evil demons at the other end of the world, so he did not know what was going on and what dangers were threatening Asgard. Loki was much frightened at the word of the Allfather. "It was my fault," he cried. "But how was I to know he was a giant? He had disguised himself so that he seemed but a strong man. And as for his horse, it looks much like that of other folk. If it were not for the horse, he could not finish this work. Ha! I have a thought. The builder shall not finish the gate. The giant shall not receive his payment. I will cheat the fellow." Now it was the last night of winter, and there remained but a few stones to put in place on top of the wondrous gateway. The giant was sure of his prize, and chuckled to himself as he went out with his horse to drag the remaining stones. for he did not know that the Aesir had guessed at last who he was, and that Loki was plotting to outwit him. Hardly had he gone to work, when out of the wood came running a pretty little mare, who neighed to Svaldifori, as if inviting the tired horse to leave his work and come to the green fields for a holiday. Svadilfori, you must remember, had been working hard all winter, with never a sight of four-footed creature of his kind, and he was very lonesome and tired of dragging stones. Giving a snort of disobedience, off he ran after this new friend towards the grassy meadows. Off went the giant after him, howling with rage and running for dear life, as he saw not only his horse but his chance of success slipping out of reach. It was a mad chase, and all Asgard thundered with the noise of galloping hoofs and the giant's mighty tread. The mare who raced ahead was Loki in disguise, and he led Svaldifori far out of reach, to a hidden meadow that he knew, so that the giant howled and panted up and down all night long, without catching even a sight of his horse. Now when the morning came, the gateway was still unfinished, and night and winter had ended at the same hour. The giant's time was over, and he had forfeited his reward. The Aesir came flocking to the gateway, and how they laughed and triumphed when they found 3 stones wanting to complete the gate. "You have failed, fellow," judged Father Odin sternly, "and no price shall we pay for work that is still undone. You have failed. Leave Asgard quickly. We have seen all we want of you and your race." Then the giant knew that he was discovered, and he was mad with rage. "It was a trick," he bellowed, assuming his own proper form, which was huge as a mountain, and towered high beside the fortress that he had built. "It was a wicked trick. You shall pay for this in one way or another. I cannot tear down the castle which, ungrateful ones, I have built for you, stronger than the strength of any giant, but I will demolish the rest of your shining city." Indeed, he would have done so in his mighty rage, but at this moment Thor, whom Heimdall had called from the end of the earth by one blast of the golden horn, came rushing to the rescue, drawn in his chariot of goats. Thor jumped to the ground close beside the giant, and before that huge fellow knew what had happened, his head was rolling upon the ground at Father Odin's feet, for with one blow Thor had put an end to the giant's wickedness and had saved Asgard. "This is the reward you deserve," Thor cried. "Not Freya nor the sun and moon, but the death that I have in store for all the enemies of the Aesir." In this extraordinary way the noble city of Asgard was made safe and complete by the addition of a fortress which no one, not even the giant who built it, could injure. It was so wonder strong. But always at the top of the gate were lacking 3 great stones that no one was mighty enough to lift. This was a reminder to the Aesir that now they had the race of giants for their everlasting enemies, and though Loki's trick had saved them Freya, and for the world the sun and moon, it was the beginning of trouble in Asgard, which lasted long as Loki lived to make mischief with his guile. End of The Giant Builder.
The Paradise of Children, from Myths That Every Child Should Know. Read by Mickey Lee Rich. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Long, long ago, when this old world was in its tender infancy, there was a child named Epimetheus, who never had either father or mother, and that he might not be lonely, another child, fatherless and motherless like himself, was sent from a far country to live with him and be his playfellow and helpmate. Her name was Pandora. The first thing that Pandora saw when she entered the cottage where Epimetheus dwelt was a great box, and almost the first question which she put to him after crossing the threshold was this: "Epimetheus, what have you in that box?" "My dear little Pandora," answered Epimetheus, "that is a secret, and you must be kind enough not to ask any questions about it." The box was left here to be kept safely, and I do not myself know what it contains." "But who gave it to you?" asked Pandora, "and where did it come from?" "That is a secret too," replied Epimetheus. "How provoking!" exclaimed Pandora, pouting her lip. "I wish the great ugly box were out of the way." "Oh, come, don't think of it any more," cried Epimetheus. "Let us run out of doors and have some fun play with the other children." It is thousands of years since Epimetheus and Pandora were alive, and the world nowadays is a very different sort of thing from what it was in their time. Then everybody was a child. There needed no fathers and mothers to take care of the children, because there was no danger nor trouble of any kind, and no clothes to be mended, and there was always plenty to eat and drink. Whenever a child wanted his dinner, he found it growing on a tree. And if he looked at the tree in the morning, he could see the expanding blossom of the night's supper, or, at eventide, he saw the tender bud of tomorrow's breakfast. It was a very pleasant life indeed. No labor to be done, no tasks to be studied, nothing but sports and dances, and sweet voices of children talking, or caroling like birds, or gushing out in merry laughter throughout the livelong day. What was most wonderful of all, the children never quarreled among themselves, never had they any crying fits, nor, since time first began, had a single one of those little mortals ever gone apart into a corner and sulked. Oh, what a good time was that to be alive in! The truth is, those ugly little winged monsters called troubles, which are now almost as numerous as mosquitoes, had never yet been seen on the earth. It is probable that the very greatest disquietude which a child had ever experienced was Pandora's vexation at not being able to discover the secret of the mysterious box. This was at first only the faint shadow of a trouble, but every day it grew more and more substantial, until before a great while the cottage of Epimetheus and Pandora was less sunshiny than those of the other children. "Whence can the box have come?" Pandora continually kept saying to herself and to Epimetheus. "And what in the world can be inside of it?" "Always talking about this box," said Epimetheus at last, for he had grown extremely tired of the subject. "I wish, dear Pandora, you would try to talk of something else. Come, let us go and gather some ripe figs and eat them under the tree for our supper. And I know a vine that has the sweetest and juiciest grapes you ever tasted." "Always talking about grapes and figs!" cried Pandora pettishly. "Well, then," said Epimetheus, who was a very good-tempered child, like a multitude of children in those days, "let us run out and have a merry time with our playmates." "I'm tired of merry times, and I don't care if I never have any more," answered our pettish little Pandora. "And, besides, I never do have any. This ugly box! I am so taken up with thinking about it all the time. I insist upon you telling me what is inside of it." "As I have already said 50 times over, I do not know," replied Epimetheus, getting a little vexed. "How, then, can I tell you what is inside?" "You might open it," said Pandora, looking sideways at Epimetheus, "and then we could see for ourselves." "Pandora, what are you thinking of?" exclaimed Epimetheus, and his face expressed so much horror at the idea of looking into a box which had been confided to him on the condition of his never opening it, that Pandora thought it best not to suggest it any more. Still, however, she could not help thinking and talking about the box. "At least," she said, "you can tell me how it came here." "It was left at the door," replied Epimetheus, "just before you came, by a person who looked very smiling and intelligent, and who could hardly forbear laughing as he put it down. He was dressed in an odd kind of cloak and had a cap that seemed to be made partly of feathers, so that it looked almost as if it had wings. "What sort of staff had he?" asked Pandora. "Oh, the most curious staff I ever saw," cried Epimetheus. "It was like two serpents twisting around a stick, and was carved so naturally that I, at first, thought the serpents were alive." "I know him," said Pandora thoughtfully. "Nobody else has such a staff. It was Quicksilver, and he brought me hither, as well as the box. No doubt he intended it for me, and most probably it contains pretty dresses for me to wear, or toys for you and me to play with, or something very nice for both to eat." "Perhaps so," answered Epimetheus, turning away. "But until Quicksilver comes back and tells us so, we have neither us any right to lift the lid of the box." "What a dull boy he is!" muttered Pandora as Epimetheus left the cottage. "I do wish he had a little more enterprise." For the first time since her arrival, Epimetheus had gone out without asking Pandora to accompany him. He went to gather figs and grapes by himself, or to seek whatever amusement he could find in other society than his little playfellows. He was tired to death of hearing about the box, and heartily wished that Quicksilver, or whatever was the messenger's name, had left it at some other child's door, where Pandora would never have set eyes on it. So perseveringly as did she babble about this one thing, the box, and nothing but the box. It seemed as if the box were bewitched. Well, it was really hard that poor Epimetheus should have a box in his ears from morning till night, especially as the little people of the earth were so unaccustomed to vexations in those happy days, and they knew not how to deal with them. Thus a small vexation made as much disturbance then as a far bigger one would in our own times. After Epimetheus had gone, Pandora stood gazing at the box. She had called it ugly above 100 times, but in spite of all that she had said against it, it was positively a very handsome article of furniture, and would have been quite an ornament to any room in which it should be placed. It was made of a beautiful kind of wood, with dark and rich veins spreading over its surface, which was so highly polished that little Pandora could see her face in it. As the child had no other looking-glass, it's odd that she did not value the box merely on this account. The edges and corners of the box were carved with most wonderful skill. Around the margin there were figures of graceful men and women and the prettiest children ever seen, reclining or sporting amid a profusion of flowers and foliage. And these various objects were so exquisitely represented and were wrought together in such harmony that flowers, foliage, and human beings seemed to combine into a wreath of mingled beauty. But here and there, peeping forth from behind the carved foliage, Pandora once or twice fancied that she saw a face not so lovely, or something other that was disagreeable, and which stole the beauty out of the rest. Nevertheless, on looking more closely and touching the spot with her finger, she could discover nothing of the kind. Some face that was really beautiful had been made to look ugly by her catching a sideways glimpse of it. The most beautiful face of all was done in what is called high relief in the center of the lid. There was nothing else save the dark, smooth richness of the polished wood and this one face in the center, with a garland of flowers about its brow. Pandora had looked at this face a great many times, and imagined that the mouth could smile if it liked, or be grave when it chose, the same as any living mouth. The features, indeed, all wore a very lively and rather mischievous expression, which looked almost as if it needs must burst out of the carved lips and utter itself in words. Had the mouth spoken, it would probably have been something like this. Do not be afraid, Pandora. What harm can there be in opening the box? Never mind that poor simple Epimetheus. You are wiser than he, and have 10 times as much spirit. Open the box, and see if you do not find something very pretty. The box, I had almost forgotten to say, was fastened, not by a lock nor by any other such contrivance, but by a very intricate knot of gold cord. There appeared to be no end to this knot, and no beginning. Never was a knot so cunningly twisted, nor with so many ins and outs, which roguishly defied the skilfullest fingers to disentangle them. And yet, by the very difficulty that there was in it, Pandora was the more tempted to examine the knot, just to see how it was made. 2 or 3 times already she had stooped over the box, and taken the knot between her thumbs and forefinger, but without positively trying to undo it. I really believe, she said to herself, that I begin to see how it was done. Nay, perhaps I could tie it up again after undoing it. There would be no harm in that, surely. Even Epimetheus would not blame me for that. I need not open the box, and should not, of course, without the foolish boy's consent, even if the knot were untied. It might have been better for Pandora if she had a little work to do, or anything to employ her mind upon, so as not to be so constantly thinking of this one subject. But children led so easy a life before any troubles came into the world, that they had really a great deal too much leisure. They could not be forever playing hide-and-seek among the flower shrubs, or at blind man's bluff with garlands over their eyes, or at whatever other games had been found out, while Mother Earth was in her babyhood. When life is all sport, toil is the real play. There was absolutely nothing to do. A little sweeping and dusting about the cottage, I suppose, and the gathering of fresh flowers, which were only too abundant everywhere, and arranging them in vases, and poor little Pandora's day's work was over. And then, for the rest of the day, there was the box. After all, I'm not quite sure that the box was not a blessing to her in its way. It supplied her with such a variety of ideas to think of and to talk about whenever she had anybody to listen. When she was in good humor, she could admire the bright polish of its sides and the rich border of beautiful faces and foliage that ran all around it. Or, if she chanced to be ill-tempered, she could give it a push or kick it with her naughty little foot. And many a kick did the box, but it was a mischievous box, as we shall see, and deserved all it got. Many a kick did it receive. But certain it is, if it had not been for the box, our active-minded little Pandora would not have known half so well how to spend her time as she now did. For it was really an endless employment to guess what was inside. What could it be indeed? Just imagine, my little hearers, how busy your wits would be if there were a great box in the house, which, as you might have no reason to suppose, contained something new and pretty for your Christmas or New Year's gifts. Do you think that you should be less curious than Pandora? If you were left alone with the box, might you not feel a little tempted to lift the lid? But you wouldn't do it. Oh, no, no. Only if you thought there were toys in it. It would be so very hard to let slip an opportunity of taking just one peep. I know not whether Pandora expected any toys, for none had yet begun to be made, probably in those days when the world itself was one great plaything for the children that dwelt upon it. But Pandora was convinced that there was something very beautiful and valuable in the box, and therefore she felt just as anxious to take a peep as any of these little girls here round me would have felt, and possibly a little more so. But of that I'm not quite so certain. On this particular day, however, which we have so long been talking about, her curiosity grew so much greater than it had usually been, that, at last, she approached the box. She was more than half determined to open it if she could. Ah, naughty Pandora. First, however, she tried to lift it. It was heavy. Quite too heavy for the slender strength of a child like Pandora. She raised one end of the box a few inches from the floor and let it fall again, with a pretty loud thump. A moment afterward, she almost fancied that she heard something stir inside of the box. She applied her ear as closely as possible and listened. Positively, there did seem to be a kind of stifled murmur within. Or was it merely the singing in Pandora's ears? Or could it be the beating of her heart? The child could not quite satisfy herself whether she had heard anything or no. But at all events, her curiosity was stronger than ever. As she drew back her head, her eyes fell upon the knot of gold cord. It must have been a very ingenious person who tied this knot, said Pandora to herself. But I think I could untie it nevertheless. I'm resolved, at least, to find the two ends of the cord. So she took the golden knot in her fingers and pried into it intricacies as sharply as she could. Almost without intending it, or quite knowing what she was about, she was soon busily engaged in attempting to undo it. Meanwhile, the bright sunshine came through the open window, as did likewise the merry voices of the children playing at a distance, and perhaps the voice of Epimetheus among them. Pandora stopped to listen. What a beautiful day it was! Would it not be wiser if she were to let the troublesome knot alone and think no more about the box, but run and join her little playfellow and be happy? All this time, however, her fingers were half unconsciously busy with the knot, and happening to glance at the flower-wreathed face on the lid of the enchanted box, she seemed to perceive it slyly grinning at her. That face looks very mischievous, thought Pandora. I wonder whether it smiles because I'm doing wrong. I have the greatest mind in the world to run away. But just then, by the merest accident, she gave the knot a kind of twist, which produced a wonderful result. The gold cord untwined itself, as if by magic, and left the box without a fastening. This is the strangest thing I ever knew, said Pandora. What will Epimetheus say, and how can I possibly tie it up again? She made one or two attempts to restore the knot, but soon found it quite beyond her skill. It had disentangled itself so suddenly that she could not in the least remember how the strings had been doubled into one another, and when she tried to recollect the shape and appearance of the knot, it seemed to have gone entirely out of her mind. Nothing was to be done, therefore, but to let the box remain as it was until Epimetheus should come in. But, said Pandora, when he finds the knot untied, he will know that I have done it. How shall I make him believe that I have not looked into the box? And then the thought came into her naughty little heart, that since she would be suspected of having looked into the box, she might just as well do so at once. Oh, very naughty and very foolish Pandora. You should have thought only of doing what was right, and of leaving undone what was wrong, and not of what your playfellow Epimetheus would have said or believed. And so perhaps she might, if the enchanted face on the lid of the box had not looked so bewitchingly persuasive at her, and if she had not seemed to hear, more distinctly than before, the murmur of small voices within. She could not tell whether it was fancy or no, but there was quite a little tumult of whispering in her ears, or else it was her curiosity that whispered. Let us out, dear Pandora, pray let us out. We will be such nice pretty playfellows for you, only let us out. "What can it be?" thought Pandora. "Is there something alive in the box? Well, yes. I am resolved to take just one peep, only one peep, and then the lid shall be shut down as safely as ever. There cannot possibly be any harm in just one little peep." But it is now time for us to see what Epimetheus was doing. This was the first time, since his little playmate had come to dwell with him, that he had attempted to enjoy any pleasure in which she did not partake. But nothing went right, nor was he nearly so happy as on other days. He could not find a sweet grape or a ripe fig. If Epimetheus had a fault, it was a little too much fondness for figs. Or, if ripe at all, they were overripe, and so sweet as to be cloying. There was no mirth in his heart, such as usually made his voice gush out of its own accord, and swell the merriment of his companions. In short, he grew so uneasy and discontented that the other children could not imagine what was the matter with him. Neither did he himself know what ailed him, any better than they did. For you must recollect that, at the time we are speaking of, it was everybody's nature, and constant habit, to be happy. The world had not yet learned to be otherwise. Not a single soul or body, since these children were sent to enjoy themselves on the beautiful earth, had ever been sick or out of sorts. At length, discovering that somehow or other he put a stop to all the play, Epimetheus judged it best to go back to Pandora, who was in a humor better suited to his own. But with a hope of giving her pleasure, he gathered some flowers and made them into a wreath, which he meant to put upon her head. The flowers were very lovely, roses and lilies and orange blossoms, and a great many more, which left a trail of fragrance behind, as Epimetheus carried them along, and the wreath was put together with as much skill as could reasonably be expected of a boy. The fingers of little girls, it had always appeared to me, are the fittest to twine flower wreaths, but boys could do it, in those days, rather better than they can now. And here I must mention that a great black cloud had been gathering in the sky for some time past, although it had not yet overspread the sun. But just as Epimetheus reached the cottage door, this cloud began to intercept the sunshine, and thus to make a sudden and sad obscurity. He entered softly, for he meant, if possible, to steal behind Pandora and fling the wreath of flowers over her head before she should be aware of his approach. But as it happened, there was no need of his treading so very lightly. He might have trod as heavily as he pleased, as heavily as a grown man, as heavily, I was going to say, as an elephant, without much probability of Pandora's hearing his footsteps. She was too intent upon her purpose. At the moment of his entering the cottage, the naughty child had put her hand to the lid and was on the point of opening the mysterious box. Epimetheus beheld her. If he had cried out, Pandora would probably have withdrawn her hand, and the fatal mystery of the box might have never been known. But Epimetheus himself, although he said very little about it, had his own curiosity to know what was inside. Perceiving that Pandora was resolved to find out the secret, he determined that his playfellow should not be the only wise person in the cottage, and, if there were anything pretty or valuable in the box, he meant to take half of it to himself. Thus, after all his sage speeches to Pandora about her restraining her curiosity, Epimetheus turned out to be quite as foolish and nearly as much at fault as she. So, whenever we blame Pandora for what happened, we must not forget to shake our heads at Epimetheus likewise. As Pandora raised the lid, the cottage grew very dark and dismal, for the black cloud had now swept quite over the sun and seemed to have buried it alive. There had for a little while past been a low growling and muttering, which all at once broke into a heavy peal of thunder. But Pandora, heeding nothing of all this, lifted the lid nearly upright and looked inside. It seemed as if a sudden swarm of winged creatures brushed past her, taking flight out of the box, while, at the same instant, she heard the voice of Epimetheus with a lamentable tone, as if he were in pain. "Oh, I am stung!" cried he. "I am stung! Naughty Pandora, why have you opened this wicked box?" Pandora let fall the lid, and starting up, looked about her to see what had befallen Epimetheus. The thundercloud had so darkened the room that she could not clearly discern what was in it. But she heard a disagreeable buzzing, as if a great many huge flies or gigantic mosquitoes, or those insects which we call door-bugs and pinching dogs, were darting about. And as her eyes grew more accustomed to the imperfect light, she saw a crowd of ugly little shapes, with bats' wings, looking abominably spiteful and armed with terribly long stings in their tails. It was one of these that had stung Epimetheus. Nor was it a great while before Pandora herself began to scream, in no less pain and affright than her playfellow, and making a vast deal more hubbub about it. An odious little monster had settled on her forehead, and would have stung her, I know not how deeply, if Epimetheus had not run and brushed it away. Now, if you wish to know what these ugly things might be, which had made their escape out of the box, I must tell you that they were the whole family of earthly troubles. There were evil passions. There were a great many species of cares. There were more than 150 sorrows. There were diseases in a vast number of miserable and painful shapes. There were more kinds of naughtiness than it would be of any use to talk about. In short, everything that has since afflicted the souls and bodies of mankind had been shut up in the mysterious box, and given to Epimetheus and Pandora to keep safely, in order that the happy children of the world might never be molested by them. Had they been faithful to their trust, all would have gone well. No grown person would ever have been sad, nor any child have had cause to shed a single tear, from that hour until this moment. But, and you may see by this how a wrong act of any one mortal is a calamity to the whole world, by Pandora's lifting the lid of that miserable box, and by the fault of Epimetheus too in not preventing her, these troubles have obtained a foothold among us, and do not seem very likely to be driven away in a hurry. For it was impossible, as you will easily guess, that the two children should keep the ugly swarms in their own little cottage. On the contrary, the first thing that they did was to fling open the doors and windows in hopes of getting rid of them, and, sure enough, away flew the winged troubles all abroad, and so pestered and tormented the small people everywhere about, that none of them so much as smiled for many days afterward. And, what was very singular, all the flowers and dewy blossoms on earth, not one of which had hitherto faded, now began to droop and shed their leaves, after a day or two. The children, moreover, who before seemed immortal in their childhood, now grew older, day by day, and came soon to be youths and maidens, and men and women by and by, and aged people, before they dreamed of such a thing. Meanwhile, the naughty Pandora, and hardly less naughty Epimetheus, remained in their cottage. Both of them had been grievously stung, and were in a good deal of pain, which seemed to be more intolerable to them because it was the very first pain that had ever been felt since the world began. Of course, they were entirely unaccustomed to it, and could have no idea what it meant. Besides all this, they were in exceedingly bad humor, both with themselves and with one another. In order to indulge it to the utmost, Epimetheus sat down sullenly in a corner with his back towards Pandora, while Pandora flung herself upon the floor and rested her head on the fatal and abominable box. She was crying bitterly and sobbing as if her heart would break. Suddenly there was a gentle little tap on the inside of the lid. "What can that be?" cried Pandora, lifting her head. But either Epimetheus had not heard the tap, or was too much out of humor to notice it. At any rate, he made no answer. "You are very unkind," said Pandora, sobbing anew, "not to speak to me." Again the tap. It sounded like the tiny knuckles of a fairy's hand, knocking lightly and playfully on the inside of the box. "Who are you?" asked Pandora, with a little of her former curiosity. "Who are you inside of this naughty box?" A sweet little voice spoke from within. "Only lift the lid, and you shall see." "No, no," answered Pandora, again beginning to sob. "I have had enough of lifting the lid. You are inside of this box, naughty creature, and there you shall stay. There are plenty of your ugly brothers and sisters already flying about the world. You need never think that I shall be so foolish as to let you out." She looked towards Epimetheus as she spoke, perhaps expecting that he would commend her for her wisdom, but the sullen boy only muttered that she was wise a little too late. "Ah," said the sweet voice again, "you had much better let me out. I am not like those naughty creatures that have stings in their tails. They are no brothers and sisters of mine. As you would see at once, if you were only to get a glimpse of me. Come, come, my pretty Pandora. I am sure you will let me out." And indeed, there was a kind of a cheerful witchery in the tone that made it almost impossible to refuse anything which the little voice asked. Pandora's heart had insensibly grown lighter at every word that came from within the box. Epimetheus, too, though still in the corner, had turned half round, and seemed to be in rather better spirits than before. "My dear Epimetheus," cried Pandora, "have you heard this little voice?" "Yes, to be sure I have," answered he, "but in no good humor as yet." "And what of it?" "Shall I lift the lid again?" asked Pandora. "Just as you please," said Epimetheus. "You have done so much mischief today that perhaps you may as well do a little more. One other trouble, in such a swarm as you have set adrift about the world, can make no very great difference." "You might speak a little more kindly," murmured Pandora, wiping her eyes. "Ah, naughty boy!" cried the little voice within the box in an arch and laughing tone. "He knows he's longing to see me. Come, my dear Pandora, lift up the lid. I'm in a great hurry to comfort you. Only let me have some fresh air, and you shall soon see that matters are not quite so dismal as you think them." "Epimetheus!" exclaimed Pandora, "come what may, I am resolved to open the box." "And as the lid seems very heavy," cried Epimetheus, running across the room, "I will help you." So with one consent, the two children again lifted the lid. Out flew a sunny and smiling little personage, and hovered about the room, throwing a light wherever she went. Have you never made the sunshine dance in dark corners by reflecting it from a bit of a looking-glass? Well, so looked the winged cheerfulness of this little fairy-like stranger amid the gloom of the cottage. She flew to Epimetheus, and laid the least touch of her finger on the inflamed spot where the trouble had stung him, and immediately the anguish of it was gone, Then she kissed Pandora on the forehead, and her hurt was cured likewise. After performing these good offices, the bright stranger fluttered sportively over the children's heads and looked so sweetly at them that they both began to think it not so very much amiss to have opened the box, since otherwise their cheery guest might have been kept a prisoner among those naughty imps with stings in their tails. "Pray, who are you, beautiful creature?" asked Pandora. "I am to be called Hope," answered the sunshiny figure, "and because I am such a cheery little body, I was packed into the box to make amends to the human race for that swarm of ugly troubles, which was destined to be let loose among them. Never fear, we shall do pretty well in spite of them all." "Your wings are colored like the rainbow," exclaimed Pandora. "How very beautiful!" "Yes, they are like the rainbow," said Hope. "Because, glad as my nature is, I am partly made of tears as well as smiles." "And will you stay with us," asked Epimetheus, "forever and ever?" "As long as you need me," said Hope with her pleasant smile. "And that will be as long as you live in the world. I promise never to desert you. There may come times and seasons now and then when you will think that I have utterly vanished, but again, and again, and again, when perhaps you least dream of it, you shall see the glimmer of my wings on the ceiling of your cottage. Yes, my dear children, and I know something very good and beautiful that it is to be given you hereafter." "Oh, tell us," they exclaimed. "Tell us what it is." "Do not ask me," replied Hope, putting her fingers on her rosy mouth. "But do not despair, even if it should never happen while you live on this earth. Trust in my promise, for it is true." "We do trust you," cried Epimetheus and Pandora, both in one breath. And so they did. And not only they, but so has everybody trusted Hope that has since been alive. And to tell you the truth, I cannot help being glad, though to be sure it was an uncommonly naughty thing for her to do. But I cannot help being glad that our foolish Pandora peeped into the box. No doubt the troubles are still flying around the world, and have increased in their multitude rather than lessened, and are a very ugly set of imps, and carry most venomous stings in their tails. I have felt them already, and expect to feel more of them as I grow older. But then that lovely and lightsome little figure of Hope. What in the world could we do without her? Hope spiritualizes the earth. Hope makes it new, and even in the earth's best and brightest aspect, Hope shows it to be only the shadow of an infinite bliss hereafter. This is the end of the Paradise of Children, from myths that every child should know. Read by Mickey Lee Rich. The Six Swans, from the Yellow Fairy Book, by various authors. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. A king was once hunting in a great wood, and he hunted the game so eagerly that none of his courtiers could follow him. When evening came on, he stood still and looked round him, and he had saw that he had quite lost himself. He sought a way out, but could find none. Then he saw an old woman with a shaking head coming toward him, but she was a witch. "Good woman," he said to her, "can you not show me the way out of the wood?" "Oh, certainly, dear king," she replied. I can quite well do that, but on one condition, which if you do not fulfill, you will never get out of the wood and will die of hunger." "What is the condition?" asked the king. "I have a daughter," said the old woman, "who is so beautiful that she has not her equal in the world, and is well fitted to be your wife. If you will make her Lady Queen, I will show you the way out of the wood." The king, in his anguish of mind, consented, and the old woman led him to her little house where her daughter was sitting by the fire. She received the king as if she were expecting him, and he thought that she was certainly very beautiful, but she did not please him, and he could not look at her without a secret feeling of horror. As soon as he had lifted the maiden onto the horse, the old woman showed him the way, and the king reached his palace, where the wedding was celebrated. The king had already been married once, and had by his first wife 7 children, 6 boys and 1 girl, whom he loved more than anything in the world. And now, because he was afraid that their stepmother might not treat them well, and might do them harm, he put them in a lonely castle that stood in the middle of the wood. It lay so hidden, and the way to it was so hard to find, that he himself could not have found out had not a wise woman given him a reel of thread which possessed a marvelous property. When he threw it before him, it unwound itself and showed him the way. But the king went so often to his dear children that the queen was offended at his absence. She grew curious, and wanted to know what he had to do quite alone in the wood. She gave his servants a great deal of money, and they betrayed the secret to her, and also told her of the reel which alone could point out the way. She had no rest now till she had found out where the king guarded the reel, and then she made some little white shirts, and, as she had learned from her witch mother, sewed an enchantment in each of them. And when the king had ridden off, she took the little shirts and went into the wood, and the reel showed her the way. The children, who saw someone coming in the distance, thought it was their dear father coming to them, and sprang to meet him very joyfully. Then she threw over each one a little shirt, which, when it touched their bodies, changed them into swans, and they flew away over the forest. The queen went home quite satisfied, and thought she had got rid of her stepchildren. But the girl had not run to meet her with her brothers, and she knew nothing of her. The next day the king came to visit his children, but he found no one but the girl. "Where are your brothers?" asked the king. "Alas, dear father," she answered, "they have gone away and left me all alone." And she told him that looking out of her little window she had seen her brothers flying over the wood in the shape of swans, and she showed him the feathers which they had let fall in the yard, and which she had collected. The king mourned, but he did not think that the queen had done the wicked deed, and as he was afraid the maiden would also be taken from him, he wanted to take her with him. But she was afraid of the stepmother, and begged the king to let her stay just one more night in the castle in the wood. The poor maiden thought, "My home is no longer here. I will go and seek my brothers." And when night came, she fled away into the forest. She ran all the night and the next day, till she could go no further from weariness. And then she saw a little hut, went in, and found a room with 6 little beds. She was afraid to lie down on one, so she crept under one of them, lay on the hard floor, and was going to spend the night there. But when the sun had set, she heard a noise, and saw 6 swans flying in at the window. They stood on the floor and blew at one another, and blew all their feathers off, and their swan skin came off like a shirt. Then the maiden recognized her brothers, and overjoyed she crept out from under the bed. Her brothers were not less delighted than she to see their little sister again, but their joy did not last long. "You cannot stay here," they said to her. "This is a den of robbers. If they were to come and find you, they would kill you." "Could you not protect me?" asked the little sister. "No," they answered, "for we can only lay aside our swan skins for a quarter of an hour every evening. For this time we regain our human forms, but then we are changed into swans again." Then the little sister cried and said, "Can you not be freed?" "Oh, no," they said. "The conditions are too hard. You must not speak or laugh for 6 years, and must make in that time 6 shirts for us out of star flowers. If a single word comes out of your mouth, all your labor is in vain." And when the brothers had said this, the quarter of an hour came to an end, and they flew away out of the window as swans. But the maiden had determined to free her brothers, even if it should cost her her life. She left the hut, went into the forest, climbed a tree, and spent the night there. The next morning she went out collecting star flowers and began to sew. She could speak to no one, and she had no wish to laugh, so she sat there looking only at her work. When she had lived there some time, it happened that the king of the country was hunting in the forest, and his hunters came to the tree on which the maiden sat. They called to her and said, "Who are you?" But she gave no answer. "Come down to us," they said. "We will do you no harm." But she shook her head silently. As they pressed her for further questions, she threw them the golden chain from her neck. But they did not leave off, and she threw them her girdle. And when this was of no use, her garters, and then her dress. The huntsman would not leave her alone, but climbed the tree, lifted the maiden down, and led her to the king. The king said, "Who are you? What are you doing up that tree?" But she answered nothing. He asked her in all the languages he knew, but she remained as dumb as a fish. Because she was so beautiful, however, the king's heart was touched, and he was seized with a great love for her. He wrapped her up in his cloak, placed her before him on his horse, and brought her to his castle. There he dressed her in rich clothes, and her beauty shone out as bright as day, but not a word could be drawn from her. He set her at table by his side, and her modest ways and behavior pleased him so much that he said, "I will marry this maiden and none other in the world." After some days he married her. But the king had a wicked mother who was displeased with the marriage, and said wicked things of the young queen. "Who knows who this girl is?" she said. "She cannot speak, and is not worthy of a king." After a year, when the queen had her first child, the old mother took it away from her. Then she went to the king and said that the queen had killed it. The king would not believe it, and would not allow any harm be done her. But she sat quietly sewing at the shirts and troubling herself about nothing. The next time she had a child, the wicked mother did the same thing. But the king could not make up his mind to believe her. He said, "She is too sweet and good to do such a thing as that. If she were not dumb and could defend herself, her innocence would be proved." But when the third child was taken away, and the queen was again accused, and could not utter a word in her own defense, the king was obliged to give her over to the law, which decreed that she must be burnt to death. When the day came on which the sentence was to be executed, it was the last day of the 6 years in which she must not speak or laugh, and now she had freed her dear brothers from the power of the enchantment. The 6 shirts were done. There was only the left sleeve wanting to the last. When she was led to the stake, she laid the shirts on her arm, and she stood on the pile, and the fire was about to be lighted. She looked around her and saw 6 swans flying through the air. Then she knew that her release was at hand, and her heart danced for joy. The swans fluttered round her and hovered low so that she could throw the shirts over them. When they had touched them, the swan skins fell off, and her brother stood before her living, well and beautiful. Only the youngest had a swan's wing instead of his left arm. They embraced and kissed each other, and the queen went to the king, who was standing by in great astonishment, and began to speak to him, saying, "Dearest husband, now that I can speak and tell you openly that I am innocent and have been falsely accused." She told him of the old woman's deceit, and how she had taken the 3 children away and hidden them. Then they were fetched, to the great joy of the king, and the wicked mother came to no good end. But the king and queen and their 6 brothers lived many years in happiness and peace. End of the Six Swans, from the Yellow Fairy Book. Read by Mickey Lee Rich.
The Tiger, the Brahman, and the Jackal, from the Indian Fairy Tales, from Joseph Jacobs. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Once upon a time, a tiger was caught in a trap. He tried in vain to get out through the bars, and rolled and bit with rage and grief when he failed. By chance, a poor Brahman came by. "Let me out of this cage, O pious one!" cried the tiger. "Nay, my friend," replied the Brahman mildly, "you would probably eat me if I did." "Not at all," swore the tiger with many oaths. "On the contrary, I should be forever grateful and serve you as a slave." Now when the tiger sobbed and sighed and wept and swore, the pious Brahman's heart softened, and at last he consented to open the door of the cage. Out popped the tiger, and seizing the poor man, cried, "What a fool you are! What is to prevent me from eating you now? For after being cooped up so long, I am just terribly hungry." In vain the Brahman pleaded for his life. The most he could gain was a promise to abide by the decision of the first 3 things he chose to question as to the justice of the tiger's action. So the Brahman first asked a peepul tree what it thought of the matter. But the peepul tree replied coldly, "What have you to complain about? Don't I give shade and shelter to every one who passes by, and don't they in return tear down my branches to feed their cattle? Don't whimper, be a man." Then the Brahman, sad at heart, went further afield till he saw a buffalo turning a well wheel, but he fared no better from it, for it answered, "You're a fool to expect gratitude. Look at me. Whilst I gave milk, they fed me on cottonseed and oil cake, but now I am dry, they yoke me here, and give me refuse as fodder." The Brahman, still more sad, asked the road to give him its opinion. "My dear sir," said the road, "how foolish you are to expect anything else. Here I am, useful to everybody, yet all, rich and poor, great and small, trample on me as they go past, giving me nothing but the ashes of their pipes and the husks of their grain." On this the Brahman turned back sorrowfully, and on the way he met a Jackal, who called out, "Why, what's the matter, Mr. Brahman? You look as miserable as a fish out of water." The Brahman told him all that had occurred. "How very confusing," said the Jackal. When the recital was ended, "Would you mind telling me over again? For everything has got so mixed up." The Brahman told it all over again, but the Jackal shook his head in a distracted sort of way, and still could not understand. "It's very odd," said he sadly, "but it all seems to go in at one ear and out at the other. I will go to the place where it all happened, and then perhaps I shall be able to give a judgment." So they returned to the cage by which the tiger was waiting for the Brahman, and sharpening his teeth and claws. "You have been away a long time," growled the savage beast, "but now let us begin our dinner." "Our dinner?" thought the wretched Brahman, as his knees knocked together with fright. What a remarkably delicate way of putting it. "Give me 5 minutes, my lord," he pleaded, "in order that I may explain matters to the Jackal here, who is somewhat slow in his wits." The tiger consented, and the Brahman began the whole story over again, not missing a single detail, and spinning as long a yarn as possible. "Oh, my poor brain! Oh, my poor brain!" cried the Jackal, wringing its paws. "Let me see. How did it all begin? You were in the cage, and the tiger came walking by." "Pooh!" interrupted the tiger. "What a fool you are! I was in the cage." "Of course!" cried the Jackal, pretending to tremble with fright. "Yes, I was in the cage. No, I wasn't. Dear, dear, where are my wits? Let me see. The tiger was in the Brahman, and the cage came walking by. No, that's not it either. Well, don't mind me, but begin your dinner, for I shall never understand." "Yes, you shall," returned the tiger, in a rage at the Jackal's stupidity. "I'll make you understand. Look here, I am the tiger." "Yes, my lord." "And that is the Brahman." "Yes, my lord." "And that is the cage." "Yes, my lord." "And I was in the cage. Do you understand?" "Yes. No. Please, my lord." "Well," cried the tiger impatiently, "please, my lord, how did you get in?" "How? Why, in the usual way, of course." "Oh, dear me, my head is beginning to whirl again. Please don't be angry, my lord, but what is the usual way?" At this the tiger lost patience, and jumping into the cage cried, "This way. Now do you understand how it was?" "Perfectly," grinned the Jackal, as he dexterously shut the door. "And if you will permit me to say so, I think matters will remain as they were." End of The Tiger, the Brahman, and the Jackal, from the Indian Fairy Tales by Joseph Jacobs, read by Aparna Bhat. The Ugly Duckling, from Hans Andersen's Fairy Tales, first series, by Hans Christian Andersen. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. It was so beautiful in the country. It was the summer time. The wheat fields were golden, the oats were green, and the hay stood in great stacks in the green meadows. The stork paraded about among them on his long red legs, chattering away in Egyptian, the language he had learned from his lady mother. All around the meadows and cornfields grew thick woods, and in the midst of the forest was a deep lake. Yes, it was beautiful. It was delightful in the country. In a sunny spot stood a pleasant old farmhouse, circled all about with deep canals, and from the walls down to the water's edge grew great burdocks, so high that under the tallest of them a little child might stand upright. The spot was as wild as if it had been in the very centre of the thick wood. In this snug retreat sat a duck upon her nest, watching for her young brood to hatch. But the pleasure she had felt at first was almost gone. She had begun to think it a wearisome task, for the little ones were so long coming out of their shells, and she seldom had visitors. The other ducks liked much better to swim about in the canals than to climb the slippery banks and sit under the burdock leaves to have a gossip with her. It was a long time to stay so much by herself. At length, however, one shell cracked, and soon another, and from each came a living creature that lifted its head and cried, "Beep, beep, quack, quack," said the mother. And then they all tried to say it too, as well as they could, while they looked all about them on every side at the tall green leaves. Their mother allowed them to look about as much as they liked, because green is good for the eyes. "What a great world it is, to be sure," said the little ones, when they found how much more room they had than when they were in the eggshell. "Is this all the world, do you imagine?" said the mother. "Wait till you have seen the garden. Far beyond that it stretches down to the pastor's field. though I have never ventured to such a distance. Are you all out?" she continued, rising to look. "No, not at all. The largest egg lies there yet, I declare. I wonder how long this business is to last. I'm really beginning to be tired of it." But for all that she sat down again. "Well, and how are you today?" quacked an old duck, who came to pay her a visit. "'Tis one egg that takes a deal of hatching. The shell is hard and will not break," said the fond mother, who sat still upon her nest. "But just look at the others. Have I not a pretty family? Are they not the prettiest little ducklings you ever saw? They are the image of their father, the good for naught. He never comes to see me." "Let me see the egg that will not break," said the old duck. "I have no doubt it's a guinea fowl's egg. The same thing happened to me once, and a deal of trouble it gave me, for the young ones are afraid of the water. I quacked and clucked, but all to no purpose. Let me take a look at it. Yes, I am right. It's a guinea fowl, upon my word. So take my advice and leave it where it is. Come to the water and teach the other children to swim." "I think I will sit a little while longer," said the mother. "I have sat so long, a day or two more won't matter." "Very well, please yourself," said the old duck, rising, and she went away. At last the great egg broke, and the latest bird cried "Peep, peep," as he crept forth from the shell. How big and ugly he was! The mother duck stared at him, and did not know what to think. "Really," she said, "this is an enormous duckling, and it is not at all like any of the others. I wonder if he will turn out to be a guinea fowl. Well, we shall see when we get to the water, for into the water he must go, even if I have to push him in myself." On the next day the weather was delightful. The sun shone brightly on the green burdock leaves, and the mother duck took her whole family down to the water and jumped in with a splash. "Quack, quack!" cried she, and one after another the little ducklings jumped in. The water closed over their heads, but they came up again in an instant, and swam about quite prettily, with their legs paddling under them as easily as possible. Their legs went up off on their own accord, and the ugly grey coat was also in the water, swimming with them. "Oh," said the mother, "that is not a guinea fowl. See how well he uses his legs, and how erect he holds himself. He is my own child, and he is not so very ugly after all, if you look at him properly. Quack, quack! Come with me now. I will take you into grand society and introduce you to the farmyard, but you must keep close to me or you may be trodden upon, and above all, beware of the cat." When they reached the farmyard, there was a wretched riot going on. Two families were fighting for an eel's head, which, after all, was carried off by the cat. "See, children, that is the way of the world," said the mother duck, wetting her beak, for she would have liked the eel's head herself. "Come, now use your legs, and let me see how well you can behave. You must bow your heads prettily to that old duck yonder. She's the highest born of them all, and has Spanish blood. Therefore she's well off. Don't you see she has a red rag tied to her leg, which is something very grand, and a great honour for a duck. It shows that every one is anxious not to lose her, and that she is to be noticed by both man and beast. Come now, don't turn in your toes. A well-bred duckling spreads his feet wide apart, just like his father and mother. This way. Now bend your necks and say quack." The ducklings did as they were bade, but the other ducks stared and said, "Look, here comes another brood, as if there were not enough of us already." And bless me, what a queer-looking object one of them is. We don't want him here." And then one flew out and bit him in the neck. "Let him alone," said the mother. "He's not doing any harm." "Yes, but he's so big and ugly. He's perfect fright," and said the spiteful duck. "And therefore he must be turned out. A little biting will do him good." "The others are very pretty children," said the old duck, with the rag on her leg. "All but that one. I wish his mother could smooth him up a bit. He's really ill-favoured." "That is impossible, your grace," replied the mother. "He's not very pretty, but he has a very good disposition, and swims as well as the others, or even better. I think he will grow up pretty, and perhaps be smaller. He has remained too long in the egg, and therefore his figure is not properly formed." And then she stroked his neck and smoothed the feathers, saying, "It's a drake, and therefore not of so much consequence. I think he will grow up strong and be able to take care of himself." "The other ducklings are graceful enough," said the old duck. "Now make yourself at home, and if you find an eel's head, you can bring it to me." And so they made themselves comfortable. But the poor duckling, who had crept out of his shell last of all, and looked so ugly, was bitten and pushed and made fun of, not only by the ducks, but by all the poultry. "He is too big," they all said. And the turkey cock, who had been born into the world with spurs and fancied himself really an emperor, puffed himself out like a vessel in full sail and flew at the duckling. He became quite red in the head with passion, so that the poor little thing did not know where to go, and was quite miserable because he was so ugly as to be laughed at by the whole farmyard. So it went on from day to day. It got worse and worse. The poor duckling was driven about by every one. Even his brothers and sisters were unkind to him, and would say, "Ah, you ugly creature! I wish the cat would get you." And his mother had been heard to say she wished he had never been born. The ducks pecked him, chickens beat him, and the girl who fed the poultry pushed him with her feet. So at last he ran away, frightening the little birds in the hedge as he flew over the palings. "They are afraid because I am so ugly," he said. So he flew still farther until he came out on a large moor inhabited by wild ducks. Here he remained the whole night, feeling very sorrowful. In the morning, when the wild ducks rose in the air, they stared at their new comrade. "What sort of a duck are you?" they all said, coming round him. He bowed to them and was as polite as he could be, but he did not reply to their question. "You're exceedingly ugly," said the wild ducks, "but that will not matter if you do not want to marry one of the family." Poor thing! He had no thoughts of marriage. All he wanted was permission to lie among the rushes and drink some of the water on the moor. After he had been on the moor 2 days, there came 2 wild geese, or rather goslings, for they had not been out of the egg long, which accounts for their impertinence. "Listen, friend," said one of them to the duckling, "you're so ugly that we like you very well. Will you go with us and become a bird of passage? Not far from here is another moor, in which there are some wild geese, all of them unmarried. It is a chance for you to get a wife. You may make your fortune, ugly as you are." Bang! Bang! sounded in the air, and the 2 wild geese fell dead among the rushes, and the water was tinged with blood. Bang! Bang! echoed far and wide in the distance, and the whole flocks of wild geese rose up from the rushes. The sound continued from every direction, for the sportsmen surrounded the moor, and some were even seated on branches of trees overlooking the rushes. The blue smoke from the guns rose like clouds over the dark trees, and as it floated away across the water, a number of sporting dogs bounded in among the rushes, which bent beneath them wherever they went. How they terrified the poor duckling! He turned away his head to hide it under his wing, and at the same moment a large, terrible dog passed quite near him. His jaws were open, His tongue hung from his mouth, and his eyes glared fearfully. He thrust his nose close to the duckling, showing his sharp teeth, and then splash, splash! He went into the water without touching him. "Oh," sighed the duckling, "how thankful I am for being so ugly! Even a dog will not bite me." And so he lay quite still, while the shot rattled through the rushes, and gun after gun was fired over him. It was late in the day before all became quiet, but even then the poor young thing did not dare to move. He waited quietly for several hours, and then, after looking carefully around him, hastened away from the moor as fast as he could. He ran over field and meadow till a storm arose, and he could hardly struggle against it. Towards evening he reached a poor little cottage that seemed ready to fall, and only seemed to remain standing because it could not decide on which side to fall first. The storm continued so violent that the duckling could go no farther. He sat down by the cottage, and then he noticed that the door was not quite closed, in consequence of one of the hinges having given away. There was, therefore, a narrow opening near the bottom large enough for him to slip through, which he did very quietly, and got a shelter for the night. Here in this cottage lived a woman, a cat, and a hen. The cat, whom his mistress called "my little son," was a great favourite. He could raise his back and purr, and could even throw out sparks from his fur if it were stroked the wrong way. The hen had very short legs, so she was called Chickie Shortlegs. She laid good eggs, and her mistress loved her as if she had been her own child. In the morning the strange visitor was discovered. The cat began to purr, and hen to cluck. "What is that noise about?" said the old woman, looking around the room. But her sight was not very good. Therefore, when she saw the duckling, she thought it must be a fat duck that had strayed from home. "Oh, what a prize!" she exclaimed. "I hope it is not a drake, for then I shall have some duck's eggs. I must wait and see." So the duckling was allowed to remain on trial for 3 weeks, but there were no eggs. Now the cat was the master of the house, and the hen was the mistress, and they always said, "We and the world," for they believed themselves to be half the world, and by far the better half too. The duckling thought that others might hold a different opinion on the subject, but the hen would not listen to such doubts. "Can you lay eggs?" she asked. "No." "Then have the goodness to cease talking. Can you raise your back, or purr, or throw out sparks?" said the cat. "No." "Then you have no right to express an opinion when sensible people are speaking." So the duckling sat in a corner, feeling very low-spirited. But when the sunshine and the fresh air came into the room through the open door, he began to feel such a great longing for a swim that he could not help speaking of it. "What an absurd idea!" said the hen. "You have nothing else to do, therefore you have foolish fancies. If you could purr or lay eggs, they would pass away." "But it is so delightful to swim about on the water," said the duckling, "and so refreshing to feel it close over your head while you dive down to the bottom." "Delightful indeed! It must be a queer sort of pleasure," said the hen. "Why, you must be crazy. Ask the cat. He's the cleverest animal I know. Ask him how he would like to swim about on the water, or to dive under it. For I will not speak of my opinion. Ask our mistress, the old woman. There is no one in the world more clever than she. Do you think she would relish swimming and letting the water close over her head?" "I see you don't understand me," said the duckling. "We don't understand you? Who can understand you, I wonder? Do you consider yourself more clever than the cat or the old woman? I will say nothing of myself. Don't imagine such nonsense, child, and thank your good fortune that you've been so well received here. Are you not in a warm room and in society from which you may learn something? But you are a chatterer. and your company is not very agreeable. Believe me, I speak only for your good. I may tell you unpleasant truths, but that is a proof of my friendship. I advise you, therefore, to lay eggs and learn to purr as quickly as possible." "I believe I must go out into the world again," said the duckling. "Yes, do," said the hen. So the duckling left the cottage and soon found water on which it could swim and dive, but he was avoided by all other animals because of his ugly appearance. Autumn came, and the leaves in the forest turned to orange and gold. Then as winter approached, the wind caught them as they fell and whirled them into the cold air. The clouds, heavy with hail and snowflakes, hung low in the sky, and the raven stood among the reeds crying, "Croak, croak." It made one shiver with cold to look at him. All this was very sad for the poor little duckling. One evening, just as the sun was setting amid radiant clouds, there came a large flock of beautiful birds out of the bushes. The duckling had never seen any like them before. They were swans, and they curved their graceful necks, while their soft plumage shone with dazzling whiteness. They uttered a singular cry as they spread their glorious wings and flew away from those cold regions to warmer countries across the sea. They mounted higher and higher in the air, and the ugly little duckling had a strange sensation as he watched them. He whirled himself in the water like a wheel, stretched out his neck towards them, and uttered a cry so strange that it frightened even himself. Could he ever forget those beautiful happy birds? And when at last they were out of his sight, he dived under the water and rose again, almost beside himself with excitement. He knew not the names of these birds, nor where they had flown, but he felt towards them as he had never felt towards any other bird in the world. He was not envious of these beautiful creatures. It never occurred to him to wish to be as lovely as they. Poor ugly creature, how gladly he would have lived even with the ducks, had they only treated him kindly and given him encouragement. The winter grew colder and colder. He was obliged to swim about on the water to keep it from freezing, but every night the space on which he swam became smaller and smaller. At length it froze so hard that the ice in the water crackled as he moved, and the duckling had to paddle with his wings as well as he could to keep the space from closing up. He became exhausted at last and lay still and helpless, frozen fast in the ice. Early in the morning a peasant who was passing by saw what had happened. He broke the ice in pieces with his wooden shoe and carried the duckling home to his wife. The warmth revived the poor little creature, but when the children wanted to play with him, the duckling thought they would do him some harm. So he started up in terror, fluttered into the milk pan, and splashed the milk about the room. Then the woman clapped her hands, which frightened him still more. He flew first into the butter cask, then into the meal tub, and out again. What a condition he was in! The woman screamed and struck at him with the tongs. The children laughed and screamed and tumbled over each other in their efforts to catch him, but luckily he escaped. The door stood open. The poor creature could just manage to slip out among the bushes and lie down, quite exhausted in the newly fallen snow. It would be very sad were I to relate all the misery and privations which the poor little duckling endured during the hard winter. But when it had passed, he found himself lying one morning in a moor amongst the rushes. He felt the warm sun shining, and heard the larks singing, and saw that all around was beautiful spring. Then the young bird felt that his wings were strong, as he flapped them against his sides and rose high into the air. They bore him onwards until, before he well knew how it had happened, he found himself in a large garden. The apple trees were in full blossom, and the fragrant elders bent their long green branches down to the stream, which wound round a smooth lawn. Everything looked beautiful in the freshness of early spring. From a thicket close by came 3 beautiful white swans, rustling their feathers and swimming lightly over the smooth water. The duckling saw these lovely birds and felt more strangely unhappy than ever. "I will fly to these royal birds," he exclaimed, "and they will kill me because, ugly as I am, I dare to approach them. But it does not matter. Better be killed by them than pecked by the ducks, beaten by the hens, pushed about by the maiden who feeds the poultry, or starved with hunger in the winter." Then he flew to the water and swam towards the beautiful swans. The moment they espied the stranger, they rushed to meet him with outstretched wings. "Kill me," said the poor bird, and he bent his head down to the surface of the water and awaited death. But what did he see in the clear stream below? His own image! No longer a dark grey bird, ugly and disagreeable to look at, but a graceful, beautiful swan. To be born in a duck's nest in a farmyard is of no consequence to a bird if it is hatched from a swan's egg. He now felt glad at having suffered sorrow and trouble, because it enabled him to enjoy so much better all the pleasure and happiness around him, for the great swans swam round the newcomer and stroked his neck with their beaks as a welcome. Into the garden presently came some little children and threw bread and cake into the water. "See," cried the youngest, "there's a new one!" And the rest were delighted, and ran to their father and mother, dancing and clapping their hands and shouting joyously, "There's another swan! Come, a new one has arrived!" Then they threw more bread and cake into the water and said, "The new one is the most beautiful of all. He's so young and pretty!" And the old swans bowed their heads before him. Then he felt quite ashamed and hid his head under his wing, for he did not know what to do. He was so happy, yet he was not at all proud. He had been persecuted and despised for his ugliness, and now he heard them say he was the most beautiful of all the birds. Even the elder tree bent down its boughs into the water before him, and the sun shone warm and bright. Then he rushed his feathers, curved his slender neck, and cried joyfully from the depths of his heart, "I never dreamed of such happiness as this while I was the despised ugly duckling." End of The Ugly Duckling, from Hans Andersen's Fairy Tales, first series. Author Hans Christian Andersen. Read by Aparna Bhat.